The ocean is vast and mysterious. For thousands of years, sailors have told stories of ships that appear and disappear without warning, crews that vanish in the middle of ordinary days, vessels found floating empty, as if their people simply walked away from life itself. These aren't just old legends or scary stories told in dark harbours. These are real events, documented by coastguards, investigated by governments, and recorded in official maritime records. Ships with names, crews with families, and mysteries that no one has ever solved. From the foggy waters off Nova Scotia to the remote corners of the Pacific, the ocean keeps secrets that challenge everything we think we know about life at sea. Modern technology, satellite tracking, and radio communication haven't stopped ships from vanishing. If anything, they've made these disappearances even more puzzling. The Mary Celeste. December 5th, 1872. The Atlantic Ocean between Portugal and the Azores. Captain David Morehouse of the Canadian brigantine DEI Gracia peers through his spyglass at a vessel on the horizon. Something isn't right. The ship moves erratically, her sails torn and flapping in the wind. No crew visible on deck, no response to their signals. As the DEI Gracia draws closer, Morehouse feels a chill of recognition. The ship drifting before them is the Mary Celeste. He knows this vessel well. He knows her captain, Benjamin Briggs, personally. They had dined together in New York just weeks before both ships departed. The Mary Celeste had left port 8 days before the DEI Gracia, carrying a cargo of denatured alcohol bound for Genoa. She should have been well ahead of them by now. First Mate Oliver DeVoe leads a boarding party across the choppy waters. What they find aboard the Mary Celeste will become maritime history's most enduring mystery. The ship is seaworthy, but completely abandoned. Tables are set as if for a meal that was never finished. The cargo holds contain 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, almost entirely intact. Personal belongings remain undisturbed in the crew quarters. Captain Briggs' sword hangs unused in his cabin. His wife Sarah's sewing kit sits exactly where she left it. The last entry in the ship's log is dated November the 25th at 8 a.m, placing the Mary Celeste 6 miles northeast of Santa Maria Island in the Azores. That was 10 days ago. 10 days of sailing without a soul on board. The ship's lifeboat is missing, along with the navigation instruments and ship's papers. But there are no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage that would explain why 10 people simply vanished from a seaworthy vessel. The official response comes swiftly. The DEI Gracia tows the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, where the British Admiralty Court opens a formal inquiry. Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood, the Queen's proctor, takes charge of the investigation. From the moment he examines the evidence, Solly Flood suspects foul play. He's convinced this is no accident. The court methodically examines every piece of evidence. The cargo manifest shows 1,701 barrels loaded in New York. When counted in Gibraltar, only 9 barrels are missing, and these show signs of natural leakage, not tampering. The ship carried enough food and water for 6 months. The crew's personal effects remain untouched. Money and valuables are found exactly where they should be. Captain Briggs had brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia on the voyage. The ship's manifest lists 7 crew members in addition to the captain's family. Albert Richardson, the first mate, the Lawrenson brothers, Volkert and Boz, both German sailors, Gottlieb Gudschal, a Dutch seaman, Arian Martins, another German crew member, and Andrew Gilling, the ship's cook and steward, all experienced sailors, all vanished without a trace. The physical evidence tells a confusing story. The main hatch is open but secured. The ship's pump has been dismantled, suggesting the crew may have been concerned about water in the hold. Yet the Mary Celeste shows no signs of taking on dangerous amounts of water. Some of the rigging is damaged, but not severely. The ship's compass is destroyed, but whether this happened before or after the abandonment remains unclear. Solly Flood develops several theories. His first suspicion falls on the crew of the DEI Gracia themselves. Could they have murdered everyone aboard the Mary Celeste for the salvage money? The timeline doesn't support this theory. The DEI Gracia left New York 8 days after the Mary Celeste, making it impossible for them to have intercepted the vessel and still maintain their documented course. The second theory involves mutiny. Perhaps the crew, having discovered the nature of their cargo, broke into the alcohol and in their drunken state murdered Captain Briggs, his family and the loyal crew members. But the denatured alcohol was poisonous, rendered undrinkable by toxic additives. Moreover, the cargo remained sealed and accounted for. Expert witnesses testify about the seaworthiness of the Mary Celeste. The ship had been recently refitted and was in excellent condition. Weather records from the period show rough seas, but nothing that would pose a serious threat to an experienced crew. The route from New York to Genoa was well travelled and familiar to Captain Briggs. The mystery deepens when investigators examine the ship's construction. The Mary Celeste was built in 1861 at Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, originally named the Amazon. She'd suffered a troubled history, with previous captains dying in office and several accidents during her early years. Some crew members had begun to whisper about a curse, but Captain Briggs was not a superstitious man. Maritime experts present competing theories about what could cause an entire crew to abandon a seaworthy ship. Waterspouts, sudden violent weather, or fears of explosion from the alcohol cargo all seem possible. But each theory faces the same problem. Why would experienced sailors abandon a ship that was clearly capable of reaching port safely? The investigation reveals that Captain Briggs was a skilled mariner with an unblemished record. He had sailed with some of his crew before and trusted them completely. His decision to bring his wife and daughter on the voyage suggests he expected a routine crossing. The ship's log shows normal daily entries right up until November 25th, with no indication of problems or concerns. After 3 months of testimony and investigation, the Gibraltar court reaches an inconclusive verdict. They find no evidence of foul play, no signs of violence, and no clear explanation for the abandonment. The court awards the DEI Gratia a modest salvage payment, far less than Solly Flood had hoped to prevent. The Mary Celeste herself is returned to her owners, who eventually sell her to new operators. The case spawns dozens of theories in newspapers and maritime journals. Some suggest the crew was poisoned by fumes from the alcohol cargo. Others propose that Captain Briggs, fearing his ship was about to founder, ordered everyone into the lifeboat, only to be swept away from the Mary Celeste by strong currents. A few even suggest piracy, though the untouched cargo and valuables make this unlikely. What makes the Mary Celeste mystery so enduring is not just what happened, but what didn't happen. No distress signals were sent. No wreckage from the lifeboat was ever found. None of the 10 missing people were ever seen again. The ship's papers, which would have contained crucial navigation information, disappeared along with the crew. Even the ship's chronometer, essential for navigation, was missing. Modern maritime experts continue to study the case, applying new technologies and understanding to the old evidence. Some point to the dangerous nature of the alcohol cargo, suggesting that fears of explosion or toxic fumes could have prompted a hasty abandonment. Others focus on the weather patterns of late November 1872, looking for sudden storms that might have created panic aboard the ship. The MV Joyita. It's October 3rd of 1955, and the sun rises over Apia Harbour in Samoa as Captain Thomas H. Miller prepares the MV Joyita for what should be a routine 2-day journey to the Tokelau Islands. The 70-foot merchant vessel, built in 1931 as a luxury yacht, now serves the Pacific Island communities as a vital supply lifeline. Her hull is filled with cork for buoyancy, making her virtually unsinkable. The Joyita has been called the little ship that couldn't sink. At 5 a.m, the Joyita departs Apia with 25 souls aboard. Captain Miller commands a crew of 15, including First Officer Chuck Simpson and Engineer James Pearson. Among the 9 passengers are Dr. Alfred Parsons, a government medical officer travelling to perform surgeries, District Officer Henry Hongi, and 2 young children. The ship carries 4 tons of cargo, medical supplies, foodstuffs, timber, and 80 empty 45-gallon oil drums bound for the remote atolls. The voyage starts with problems. One of the Joyita's 2 diesel engines fails before departure, but Captain Miller decides to proceed anyway. The single remaining engine gives the ship a cruising speed of just 10 knots. The 270-mile journey to Tokelau, normally a 27-hour trip, will now take much longer. Radio set operator Henry Hongi sends regular position reports during the first day, but these transmissions grow increasingly weak and distorted. October 4th passes without incident. The Joyita makes steady progress through calm Pacific waters. Radio contact continues sporadically, with Hongi reporting their position as approximately 200 miles from Samoa. The weather is fair with gentle swells and light winds. everything appears normal aboard the merchant vessel that many consider unsinkable due to her cork-filled hull and watertight compartments. October 5th brings the first sign of trouble. The Joyita fails to arrive at Fakofo Atoll in Tokelau as scheduled. Local officials wait through the day, scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of the supply ship. When darkness falls without any sign of the vessel, concern begins to spread through the small island community. The Joyita has never been late before. The immediate response comes from both civilian and military authorities. The Royal New Zealand Air Force launches search aircraft from Fiji, systematically combing thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. The US Navy joins the effort, dispatching vessels and planes to search the Joyita's intended route. For 5 weeks, aircraft and ships crisscross the vast expanse of water between Samoa and Tokelau, finding nothing. November 10th, 1955. Captain Gerald Douglas of the merchant ship Tuvalu spots something unusual in the waters north of Fiji, more than 600 miles from the Joyita's planned route. Through his binoculars, he sees a vessel listing heavily to starboard, partially submerged and barely afloat. As the Tuvalu approaches, Douglas realizes he's found the missing MV Joyita. The condition of the Joyita tells a story of disaster. The superstructure is partially submerged, with only the bridge and parts of the deck visible above water. The vessel lists at a dangerous angle, kept afloat only by her cork-filled hull. Most shocking of all, there's no sign of the 25 people who departed Samoa 5 weeks earlier. The ship appears completely abandoned. Official investigators board the waterlogged vessel to begin their examination. The evidence they find raises more questions than answers. The ship's logbook is missing, along with all navigation equipment and life preservers. The cargo holds are largely empty, with most of the medical supplies, food and timber gone. However, the 80 oil drums remain secured in place, their weight contributing to the ship's dangerous list. The investigation reveals critical damage to the hull. A large section of the starboard side shows signs of impact, with metal plates bent inward. This damage extends below the waterline, explaining why the Joyita was taking on water despite her supposedly unsinkable design. The single working engine is found to be in running condition, though the fuel tanks are nearly empty. Physical evidence suggests the crew attempted to deal with an emergency. The ship's pump system shows signs of recent use, indicating efforts to remove water from the hull. Life rafts and lifeboats are missing, along with emergency supplies. Personal belongings remain scattered throughout the vessel, but valuables like money and watches are gone. The official inquiry, led by maritime authorities from New Zealand and Fiji, examines multiple theories about what happened to the MV Joyita. The first theory centres on the hull damage. Could the ship have struck a reef or been involved in a collision? The isolated location where the Joyita was found, far from shipping lanes and known hazards, makes this explanation problematic. A second theory suggests piracy. The missing cargo and valuables, combined with the remote location, point to possible attack by modern pirates operating in the Pacific. However, the carefully secured oil drums and the ship's condition argue against this explanation. Pirates would likely have taken everything valuable and sunk the evidence. The mutiny theory emerges from examination of the crew manifest. Some investigators suggest that members of the crew, possibly under the influence of alcohol or driven by desperation, turned against Captain Miller and the passengers. This theory attempts to explain both the missing people and the selective removal of cargo and supplies. Weather records from October 1955 show no significant storms in the area during the Joyita's voyage. The Pacific was experiencing normal conditions, with moderate seas and light winds. This eliminates sudden weather as a cause for the disaster, making the mystery even more puzzling. Robin Morm, the travel writer who later purchased the salvaged Joyita, spent years investigating the mystery. His research uncovered troubling details about the ship's condition and crew. The vessel had been experiencing mechanical problems for months before the fatal voyage. Several crew members had criminal records, and tensions existed between Captain Miller and some of his subordinates. The structural analysis of the Joyita reveals a critical flaw in the unsinkable design. While the cork-filled hull provided buoyancy, the watertight compartments had been compromised by years of modifications. Water entering through the damaged starboard side could spread throughout the ship, eventually making it impossible to keep afloat with the available pumping equipment. Expert testimony suggests that Captain Miller faced a terrible choice when the hull damage occurred. With one engine failed and the ship taking on water, he could have ordered everyone into the lifeboats and life rafts. In moderate seas, this might have seemed like the safer option than staying with a sinking vessel. However, the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean made rescue unlikely for small boats. The investigation examines the possibility of equipment failure contributing to the disaster. The radio equipment was found damaged, which could explain why no distress signals were received. The navigation instruments were missing, possibly taken by the crew when they abandoned ship. This suggests a planned evacuation rather than a sudden catastrophe. Marine salvage experts who examined the wreck calculated that the Joyita could have remained afloat for days or even weeks after the initial damage. The cork-filled hull, despite its design flaws, provided enough buoyancy to keep the vessel from sinking completely. This raises the disturbing possibility that the ship continued drifting long after her crew and passengers had perished. The search for the 25 missing people continues for months after the discovery of the Joyita. Aircraft and vessels scour the waters near Fiji and along the vessel's probable drift path. Small islands and remote atolls are searched for signs of survivors or wreckage from the lifeboats. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of the missing people is ever found. The official report concludes that the MV Joyita suffered catastrophic hull damage from an unknown cause, forcing the crew and passengers to abandon ship. The report cannot determine whether this was due to collision, explosion, or structural failure. The fate of the 25 people remains unknown, though the investigators assume they perished at sea after leaving the damaged vessel. The MV Joyita was eventually sold at auction and briefly returned to service under new owners. However, the ship's reputation as a cursed vessel made it difficult to find crews willing to sail her. After several more incidents and mechanical failures, the Joyita was abandoned and left to rot in a Pacific harbour, finally succumbing to the elements that had claimed her crew and passengers years earlier. The SV Zabrina. By the autumn of 1917, the Great War had transformed the world's oceans into hunting grounds of death. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, turning merchant vessels into floating coffins. In that single year, over 3,700 Allied merchant ships would fall victim to submarine warfare. The English Channel, once a peaceful corridor between Britain and France, had become a graveyard where 30,000 men would lose their lives before the guns fell silent. Against this backdrop of maritime terror, merchant sailors continued their dangerous work. These were ordinary men sailing ordinary ships, carrying the coal, food and supplies that kept the war effort alive. They knew the risks, every voyage could be their last. But the cargo had to get through. The SV Zabrina was one of these vessels, a three-masted sailing barge built in 1873 for the humble task of moving coal across the channel. The Zabrina represented a dying breed of commercial sailing ships. At 189 tons, she was built for reliability rather than speed. Her three masts and schooner rig made her efficient in the variable winds of the English Channel. Captain Martin commanded a crew of 5 experienced sailors, men who had made this crossing countless times before the war turned their routine journeys into acts of courage. October the 15th, 1917. The Zabrina departs Falmouth, Cornwall, laden with Swansea coal bound for Saint-Brieuc in France. This marks her second attempt at this voyage. Just 3 days earlier, rough weather had forced her to turn back to port. Now, with calmer seas, Captain Martin decides to try again. The crew secures the cargo and prepares for what should be a routine 2-day crossing. The cargo itself tells the story of wartime Britain. Coal from the Welsh valleys, loaded onto ships in Swansea, then carried by vessels like the Zabrina to fuel the French war effort. Every ton of coal that reached France meant another day the Allies could continue fighting. The German U-boat commanders understood this connection. They targeted merchant vessels not just to sink ships, but to strangle the economic lifeline that kept their enemies alive. 2 days later, October 17, 1917, French fishermen making their morning rounds off Roselle Point near Cherbourg noticed something unusual. A three-masted sailing barge sits motionless in the shallow waters, listing slightly to starboard. Her sails hang loose from the rigging, and there's no sign of life aboard. The fishermen approach cautiously, calling out to the vessel. No response comes from the eerily silent ship. The discovery reveals a scene that will haunt maritime investigators for generations. The Zabrina sits aground in just 6 feet of water, her hull intact and her cargo of coal still secure in the holds. The ship appears undamaged with no obvious signs of attack or collision, yet as the French authorities board the vessel, they find themselves walking through a ghost ship where time seems to have stopped. The crew's personal belongings remain exactly where they left them. Sea chests sit unopened in the forecastle. Clothing hangs on hooks as if the owners had just stepped away for a moment. The ship's galley contains the remains of a meal, with plates still on the table and a kettle on the stove. Everything suggests the crew vanished suddenly, without time to gather their possessions or secure the ship. The investigation begins immediately. French naval authorities, working with British maritime officials, attempt to piece together what happened during those crucial 2 days between departure and discovery. The Zabrina's cargo remains untouched, ruling out piracy as a motive. The ship's hull shows no damage from torpedo or shell fire, eliminating the most obvious wartime explanation. Weather records from October 15th through 17th show rough seas but nothing extraordinary for the season. The English Channel in autumn typically produces challenging conditions, but experienced sailors like Captain Martin's crew would have handled such weather routinely. The Zabrina's position off Roselle Point suggests she was close to her destination when whatever happened occurred. The timing of the discovery places the Zabrina incident within a pattern of mysterious disappearances that plagued the wartime shipping lanes. Just months earlier, similar vessels had vanished without explanation. The war created an atmosphere where normal maritime accidents became shrouded in mystery and suspicion. Every missing ship could be the victim of enemy action, equipment failure, or something far more sinister. U-boat activity in the English Channel during October 1917 was intense. German submarines were conducting regular patrols, attacking merchant vessels and naval ships alike. The possibility that a U-boat encountered the Zabrina becomes the focus of initial investigations. Perhaps the submarine surfaced, ordered the crew to abandon ship, then submerged without sinking the vessel when other ships appeared on the horizon. This theory gained support from similar incidents documented throughout the war. U-boat commanders sometimes followed prize rules, ordering crews to abandon ship before sinking their vessels. If the Zabrina's crew took to their lifeboats during such an encounter, rough seas could have prevented their return to the ship. The submarine, possibly spotting approaching vessels, might have submerged without completing the attack. Alternative theories emerge as investigators examine the physical evidence. The ship's position in shallow water suggests she may have been deliberately beached. Perhaps Captain Martin, facing some emergency, ordered the crew to run the Zabrina aground to prevent her from sinking in deeper water. The crew might have planned to return at low tide to refloat the vessel, only to be swept away by the strong channel currents. The search for the missing crew expands across the channel. French coastal authorities examine beaches and rocky shores for signs of wreckage or bodies. British naval vessels patrol the sea lanes, looking for survivors or debris from the Zabrina's lifeboats. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of Captain Martin or his 5 crew members is ever found. The case of the Zabrina fits into a broader pattern of wartime maritime mysteries. Ships disappearing without distress signals, crews vanishing from seaworthy vessels, and cargo arriving at destination ports aboard empty ships. The war created conditions where normal explanations seemed inadequate. Every mystery carried the potential for enemy action, sabotage, or new forms of warfare that challenged traditional understanding. Maritime experts studying the Zabrina case note similarities to other ghost ship incidents from the period. The SV Fanny E. Woolston, found abandoned in the North Sea in 1921, showed similar signs of sudden evacuation. The merchant vessel Bayard, discovered drifting empty near the Azores in 1918, had her crew vanish under equally mysterious circumstances. These cases suggest a pattern that transcends individual incidents. The investigation reveals troubling gaps in the official record. The Zabrina's departure from Falmouth was logged, but no intermediate position reports exist. The ship's planned route would have taken her through waters regularly patrolled by both British and German vessels. Yet none of these patrols reported contact with the Zabrina during her final voyage. Scientific analysis of the ship's condition provides few answers. The vessel shows no signs of explosion, fire, or structural damage. Her compass remains functional, and her charts are undisturbed. The absence of the ship's lifeboat suggests the crew evacuated voluntarily, but the calm arrangement of personal belongings argues against a hasty abandonment. the Zabrina's fate becomes intertwined with the broader tragedy of World War I maritime casualties. Over 14,000 British merchant seamen died during the conflict, many in circumstances that were never fully explained. The war's conclusion brought no closure to families still searching for answers about their missing loved ones. The French authorities eventually refloat the Zabrina and put her back into service. She continues carrying cargo across the Channel for several more years, but her reputation as a ghost ship follows her. Crew members report strange occurrences aboard the vessel, unexplained sounds, and the persistent feeling that the ship remains haunted by her missing crew. The Carroll A. Deering. The morning light cuts through the Atlantic haze as Coast Guard lookout C.P. Brady raises his binoculars to scan the treacherous waters off Cape Hatteras. What he sees through the lens on this cold January morning will launch one of America's most investigated maritime mysteries. A massive 5-masted schooner sits helplessly aground on Diamond Shoals, her white sails billowing in the wind, her towering masts reaching toward the grey sky like skeletal fingers. The ship appears intact, almost majestic in her final resting place, yet something feels deeply wrong about the scene unfolding before Brady's eyes. The Carroll A. Deering stretches 255 feet from bow to stern, her 5 masts making her one of the largest sailing vessels still working American waters. Built in 1919 by the G.G. Deering Company in Bath, Maine, she represents the twilight of the great age of commercial sailing ships. As Brady studies the grounded vessel, he notices her sails are set for sailing, not anchored. The ship's positioning suggests she was underway when she ran aground, but there's no sign of life aboard the massive schooner. The rescue efforts begin immediately, but rough seas and the ship's precarious position on the shoals make approach dangerous. When Coast Guard crews finally reach the Carroll A. Deering on February 4th, they find a scene that will haunt maritime investigators for decades. The ship is completely abandoned, her crew quarters empty, her galley cold. Personal belongings remain scattered throughout the vessel, but all the crew's navigational instruments, logbooks and lifeboats are missing. Most unsettling of all, the ship's steering wheel has been removed, leaving only the bare steering post. To understand what happened aboard the Carroll A. Deering, we must know the men who sailed her on that final voyage. Captain Willis B. Wormel, 66 years old, had spent his life at sea. A respected mariner from Portland, Maine, Wormel had come out of retirement to command the Deering after the original captain fell ill. His weathered hands had guided ships through storms and calm alike for 4 decades. His wife waited for him in their Portland home, unaware that her husband's final voyage would end in mystery. First mate Charles B. McClellan brought a different energy to the ship. Younger than Wormel, McClellan had a reputation for both competence and volatility. During the Deering's stop in Barbados on January 9, 1921, McClellan had gotten drunk at the Continental Hotel and been overheard by other captains complaining bitterly about Wormel's leadership. He claimed he couldn't properly discipline the crew because the captain interfered with his authority. These words would later take on ominous significance. The crew that sailed with Wormel represented the changing face of American maritime labour. Most were foreign-born sailors, men who had found work on American ships during the post-war shipping boom. Herbert Bates, the ship's engineer, was the one crew member Wormel trusted completely. Bates had sailed with Wormel before, and the captain spoke highly of his reliability and skill. The other crew members remained largely anonymous in the official records, their names and stories lost to time. The Deering's final voyage began on December 2, 1920, when she departed Rio de Janeiro bound for Baltimore with no cargo. The ship had successfully delivered a load of coal to Brazil and now sailed in ballast, riding high in the water. The voyage should have been routine, a familiar run up the American coast that Wormel had made countless times before. The crew appeared in good spirits as they left the warm waters of South America behind. On January 9, 1921, the Carroll A. Deering made her final documented port call in Barbados. Captain Wormel went ashore to take on supplies and water, while his crew enjoyed their last shore leave. It was during this stop that First Mate McClellan's drinking and complaints about the captain became public knowledge. Other ship captains in port noticed the tension between Wormel and his subordinate, but such conflicts were common aboard merchant vessels. The ship's final confirmed sighting came on January 29, 1921, when she passed the Cape Lookout lightship off North Carolina, The lightship keeper later reported that someone aboard the Deering had shouted across the water that the ship had lost her anchors and requested that the lightship report this to the company. The voice calling out was described as having a foreign accent, unusual since both Captain Wormel and First Mate McClellan were American-born. What happened during the next 48 hours remains one of maritime history's greatest puzzles. The Caroline Deering covered approximately 80 miles between Cape Lookout and Diamond Shoals, a distance that should have taken her less than a day in fair weather. Weather records show moderate conditions with good visibility, nothing that would challenge an experienced crew. Yet somewhere during this final stretch, 11 men vanished without a trace. The investigation that followed involved multiple government agencies and consumed thousands of hours of official time. The Coast Guard, Navy, and Department of Commerce all participated in what became known as the Deering investigation. Officials interviewed everyone who had contact with the ship during her final voyage, analysed every piece of physical evidence, and pursued dozens of theories about what might have happened to the crew. The physical evidence painted a picture of hasty abandonment. The ship's 2 lifeboats were missing, along with all navigation equipment and the ship's official papers. The crew's personal belongings remained in their quarters, but their sea bags and any valuable items were gone. The galley showed signs of recent meal preparation, with pots still on the stove and food in various stages of cooking. The families of the missing men waited anxiously for news. Captain Wormel's wife in Portland received no word from her husband after the ship's departure from Barbados. Herbert Bates's family in Boston held out hope that their loved one might have survived in one of the lifeboats. The families of the foreign crew members faced additional challenges, as language barriers and distance made communication with investigators difficult. One of the most significant pieces of evidence emerged months later, when a bottle containing a message washed ashore on the North Carolina coast. The note, written on ship stationery, read, "Deering captured by oil-burning boat, something like chaser. Taking off everything handcuff crew. Crew hiding all over ship, got it. Engine room. No chance to make escape. Finder please notify headquarters, Deering." Handwriting experts later confirmed the note was written by Herbert Bates, the ship's engineer. The message from Bates opened new avenues of investigation. The reference to an oil-burning boat, something like chaser, suggested the involvement of another vessel, possibly a government ship or disguised pirate vessel. The mention of handcuffs and the crew hiding all over ship painted a picture of violence and forced captivity. Yet questions remained about the note's authenticity and the circumstances of its writing. The mutiny theory gained credibility as investigators learned more about the tensions between Captain Wormel and First Mate McClellan. Several witnesses in Barbados reported McClellan's drunken complaints about the captain's interference. The foreign composition of most of the crew, combined with the post-war labour tensions, created conditions where mutiny seemed possible. Perhaps McClellan had convinced the crew to take control of the ship, leading to violence when Wormel resisted. Alternative theories focused on piracy, still a real threat in 1921. The note from Herbert Bates suggested capture by an unknown vessel, possibly operated by rum runners or other criminal elements. The Deering's valuable cargo holds, even when empty, made her a potential target for pirates who might force the crew to pilot the ship to a remote location before eliminating the witnesses. The impact on the maritime community was profound. The Carol A. Deering's disappearance occurred during a period when several ships vanished under mysterious circumstances, creating fear among sailors and shipping companies. The Coast Guard increased patrols along the eastern seaboard, and shipping companies began requiring more frequent radio contact with their vessels. The investigation continued for years, with officials following every lead and pursuing every theory. The FBI joined the effort, treating the case as a possible act of piracy or foreign interference. Despite the extensive investigation, no definitive explanation for the fate of the 11 men ever emerged. The Caroline, Deering had given up her crew to the sea, but the sea refused to give up its secrets. The SS Baychimo. The Arctic Ocean in the 1920s was not just a frozen wilderness, but a commercial frontier where fortunes were made and lost. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, had survived by adapting to changing times and markets. When the Great Depression began to strangle global trade, the company's ships still ventured into the most remote corners of the Arctic, carrying supplies to isolated trading posts and returning with precious furs that could still command high prices in distant markets. In this harsh economic climate, the SS Baychimo represented both hope and necessity. Originally built in 1914 as the Angermanelven in Swedish shipyards, she had been purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1921 and renamed for her new Arctic mission. The 322-ton cargo steamer was built to withstand the crushing forces of pack ice, her steel hull reinforced to push through frozen barriers that would destroy lesser vessels. The Baychimo's mission was simple but vital: supply the scattered trading posts along the Arctic coast of Canada and Alaska, then return south with holds full of fox pelts, seal skins, and other furs. For 9 years, she had successfully completed this dangerous annual cycle, her crew becoming skilled at reading ice conditions and weather patterns that could mean the difference between profit and disaster. Captain Sidney Cornwall had commanded the Baychimo since 1922, navigating her through Arctic waters that claimed ships and crews with ruthless efficiency. By 1931, he was an experienced Arctic mariner who understood both the promise and peril of northern waters. His crew included skilled seamen familiar with the unique challenges of Arctic navigation, men who could read ice formations and weather signs that meant nothing to sailors from temperate waters. The 1931 voyage began like any other. The Baychimo departed from her southern port in early summer, loaded with supplies for the remote trading posts scattered along the Arctic coast. Her holds contained everything from food and medicine to tools and trade goods that would be exchanged for furs throughout the brief Arctic summer. The ship's schedule was tight, as the window for Arctic navigation closed quickly when winter returned. Throughout the summer of 1931, the Baychimo followed her familiar route, visiting trading posts from the Mackenzie Delta to the Beaufort Sea. At each stop, Captain Cornwall's crew unloaded supplies and took on valuable furs. The ship's holds gradually filled with white fox pelts, the most prized commodity in the Arctic fur trade. These pelts would fetch high prices in southern markets, making the dangerous voyage profitable despite the risks. By September 1931, the Baychimo had completed most of her trading mission. Her holds were filled with furs worth thousands of dollars, and Captain Cornwall was preparing for the return journey south. However, weather conditions in the Arctic were changing rapidly. An unusually early and severe winter was approaching, bringing with it the pack ice that could trap ships for months. On September 15, 1931, the Baychimo became trapped in pack ice near the Seahorse Islands off the coast of Alaska. This was not unusual for Arctic vessels, and Captain Cornwall had dealt with similar situations before. The crew prepared to wait for the ice to break up, using techniques developed over decades of Arctic navigation. They settled in for what they hoped would be a brief delay. The ice, however, refused to cooperate. As days turned to weeks, the pack ice tightened its grip on the Baychimo. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure, and Captain Cornwall realized they faced a serious situation. The brief Arctic summer was ending, and the window for escape was rapidly closing. The crew began to consider the possibility that they might be trapped until the following spring. In early October, the situation became critical. The ice continued to build around the ship, creating immense pressure that threatened to crush the hull. Captain Cornwall made the difficult decision to abandon the Baychimo temporarily, taking his crew to safety while leaving the ship frozen in the ice. The Hudson's Bay Company arranged for the crew to be transported south, assuming the ship would be crushed and lost when the ice shifted. The valuable cargo of furs presented a problem that could not be ignored. Captain Cornwall and a small crew returned to the frozen Baychimo in November 1931, determined to salvage what they could before the ship was destroyed. Working in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, they removed the most valuable furs from the ship's holds, loading them onto sleds for transport to safety. On November 24, 1931, Captain Cornwall and his crew made their final departure from the SS Baychimo. The ship remained frozen in the pack ice, her hull intact but her fate seemingly sealed. Everyone expected the massive forces of the Arctic ice to crush the vessel during the winter months, reducing her to scrap metal and memories. The following spring brought an unexpected development. The ice had not crushed the Baychimo. Instead, the pack ice had shifted and broken up, freeing the ship from her frozen prison. Leslie Melvin, travelling to Nome in March 1932, reported seeing the Baychimo drifting freely in the Beaufort Sea, apparently undamaged by her ordeal in the ice. The abandoned ship had somehow survived the crushing forces that destroyed other vessels. This first sighting launched a legend that would endure for decades. The Baychimo, now sailing without crew or cargo, became the most famous ghost ship in Arctic waters. Sightings came from Inuit hunters, passing aircraft and other vessels navigating the northern waters. Each report described the same phenomenon, a steel-hulled cargo ship moving through Arctic waters with no sign of human activity aboard. The sightings followed a pattern that reflected the Baychimo's drift through Arctic currents. She was spotted in 1933, 1934, and 1935, each time in different locations along the Arctic coast. Some observers reported that the ship appeared to be in good condition, her superstructure intact and her hull apparently sound. Others noted signs of weather damage and the accumulation of ice and snow on her decks. In 1939, a group of Inuit hunters found the Baychimo frozen in ice again, this time near the Coppermine River. They boarded the abandoned vessel and discovered that nature had begun to reclaim the ship. Ice had formed inside the hull, and Arctic wildlife had made homes in the empty spaces. Yet the ship's basic structure remained sound, testament to the quality of her construction. The search and rescue operations that followed sightings of the Baychimo were unlike any others in maritime history. Rather than looking for survivors, searchers hoped to recapture a valuable piece of maritime property. The Hudson's Bay Company maintained its claim to the ship, and several attempts were made to board and recover the vessel. However, the Baychimo proved elusive, always managing to drift away before recovery efforts could be completed. The pattern of sightings continued through the 1940s and 1950s. Aircraft pilots reported seeing the distinctive silhouette of a cargo steamer in waters where no active shipping occurred. Naval vessels occasionally encountered the drifting ship, but the harsh Arctic conditions and the ship's unpredictable movements made capture difficult. The Baychimo had become more than a ship. She had become a legend. Analysis of what kept the Baychimo afloat for so many years reveals the sophisticated engineering of early, 20th century Arctic vessels. Her reinforced hull and watertight compartments allowed her to survive impacts and conditions that would sink conventional ships. The cold Arctic waters slowed deterioration, while the ship's steel construction resisted the organic decay that would have claimed wooden vessels. The economic context of the Baychimo's abandonment reflects the broader collapse of the Arctic fur trade during the Great Depression. Falling fur prices made the expensive and dangerous Arctic voyages economically unfeasible. The Hudson's Bay Company was forced to abandon not just the Baychimo, but entire trading posts throughout the Arctic, marking the end of an era in northern commerce. The last confirmed sighting of the SS Baychimo came in 1969, when a group of Inuit hunters reported seeing the ship frozen in an ice pack near the Alaskan coast. This final encounter occurred 38 years after the ship was abandoned, making the Baychimo the longest surviving ghost ship in maritime history. After 1969, despite numerous searches and investigations, the ship vanished without a trace. The legacy of the SS Baychimo extends beyond maritime history into the realm of Arctic exploration and environmental change. Her decades-long drift through Arctic waters coincided with significant changes in northern ice patterns and ocean currents. Some researchers suggest that climate change may have contributed to the ship's final disappearance, as shifting ice conditions altered the Arctic environment that had sustained her ghost voyage. The MV Lyubov Orlova. In the modern age of satellite tracking and GPS navigation, ships don't simply vanish. Every vessel carries emergency beacons, radio equipment, and identification systems that make disappearance nearly impossible. Yet on February 23, 2013, maritime authorities around the world received an electronic distress signal that would trigger one of the most unusual investigations in recent maritime history. The signal came from 700 miles off the coast of Ireland, transmitted by an emergency position indicating radio beacon registered to the MV Lyubov Orlova, a ship that shouldn't have been there. The immediate response came from the Canadian Transportation Safety Board, which had been tracking the Lyubov Orlova since January 24th, when she broke free from a towing operation gone wrong. The board's investigation team had been monitoring the situation for weeks, but the activation of the emergency beacon suggested something catastrophic had occurred to the drifting vessel. Search and rescue coordinators in Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Canada began coordinating efforts to locate the source of the distress signal. The evidence presented by the emergency beacon was both precise and disturbing. The signal indicated that the ship's automatic distress system had been triggered, either by impact with water or by the vessel taking on significant amounts of water. The beacon's location, transmitted via satellite, placed the Lyubov Orlova in the middle of the North Atlantic shipping lanes, exactly where maritime traffic controllers feared she might drift. To understand how a decommissioned Soviet cruise ship came to be floating abandoned in international waters, investigators had to examine a chain of events that began in St. John's, Newfoundland. The MV Lyubov Orlova had been built in 1976 in Yugoslavia for the Soviet Union, named after the famous Russian actress Lyubov Orlova. For decades, she'd carried passengers on Arctic cruises, her ice-strengthened hull making her ideal for polar expeditions. By 2010, the ship had been abandoned in St. John's Harbour by her owners, who could no longer afford the mounting costs of maintenance and port fees. The vessel became a legal nightmare, with unpaid bills exceeding $200,000 and no clear ownership. Local authorities eventually seized the ship and arranged for her to be towed to the Dominican Republic for scrapping, a common fate for decommissioned vessels. The towing operation that would ultimately lead to the Lyubov Orlova's disappearance began on January 23, 2013. The tug Charlene Hunt, operated by NL Group Ocean, took on the challenging task of towing the 250-ton cruise ship across the Atlantic. The Transportation Safety Board's investigation revealed that the towing arrangement was inadequate for the conditions they would encounter. Captain William Jackman of the Charlene Hunt had experience with towing operations, but the Lyubov Orlova presented unique challenges. The ship's superstructure created massive wind resistance, and her deep draft made her difficult to control in rough seas. The towing cable, rated for the ship's weight, had not been tested under the dynamic stresses of ocean towing in winter conditions. Less than 24 hours after departure, the towing arrangement failed catastrophically. At approximately 2:45 p.m. on January 24th, heavy weather off Cape Race, Newfoundland, caused the towing cable to snap. The Lyubov Orlova, now free from her tow, began drifting with the North Atlantic currents. Multiple attempts to re-establish the tow failed due to deteriorating weather conditions and mechanical problems aboard the tug. The investigation revealed a series of cascading failures that turned a routine towing operation into a maritime disaster. The crew of the Charlene Hunt had insufficient experience with long-distance ocean towing. The weather conditions were more severe than anticipated, with winds exceeding 40 knots and waves reaching 15 feet. Most critically, the backup towing equipment proved inadequate when the primary arrangement failed. Expert witnesses testified about the dangers posed by the drifting vessel. The Lyubov Orlova, with no power and no crew, became a floating hazard in one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Her steel hull could cause catastrophic damage to any vessel that collided with her, while her unpredictable drift pattern made avoidance difficult. Maritime traffic controllers began issuing warnings to all vessels in the North Atlantic. The competing theories about the ship's fate emerged as investigators analysed the evidence. The first theory suggested that the Lyubov Orlova had simply sunk due to structural failure. The ship had been abandoned for years, and her hull may have been compromised by lack of maintenance. The emergency beacon activation supported this theory, as the devices automatically trigger when they contact water during a sinking. A second theory focused on the ship's construction and contents. The Lyubov Orlova contained significant amounts of asbestos and other hazardous materials, as was common in Soviet-era ships. Some experts suggested that the ship might have broken apart in heavy seas, scattering debris and dangerous materials across the ocean floor. The emergency beacon would have activated as the ship's structure failed. The most sensational theory emerged from reports about the ship's non-human passengers. During her years of abandonment in St. John's, the Lyubov Orlova had become home to a large population of rats. Media reports suggested that these rats, trapped aboard the drifting vessel, had resorted to cannibalism to survive. While this theory captured public imagination, maritime experts dismissed it as having no bearing on the ship's ultimate fate. Satellite tracking provided crucial evidence for the investigation. The Lyubov Orlova's drift pattern was consistent with North Atlantic current models, carrying her from the Newfoundland coast toward the shipping lanes between Europe and North America. The ship's position when the first emergency beacon activated placed her approximately 1,300 miles from the Irish coast, well within the predicted drift zone. the investigation weighed multiple explanations for the emergency beacon activation. The devices are designed to activate automatically when submerged or when manually triggered by crew members. Since the Lyubov Orlova had no crew, automatic activation was the only possibility. This could occur if the ship took on water, if the beacon was damaged by weather, or if the ship's structure failed. A second emergency beacon signal was detected on March 8, 2013, from a position further south in the Atlantic. This signal lasted only briefly before cutting off permanently. The activation of two separate emergency beacons suggested that the ship was breaking apart, with different sections sinking at different times. This pattern was consistent with structural failure in heavy seas. The witness testimony painted a picture of a vessel that was never intended to survive alone in the North Atlantic. The Lyubov Orlova's crew quarters, dining rooms, and passenger areas were not designed for the stresses of unmanned ocean drift. Ice formation, water ingress, and metal fatigue would have combined to weaken the ship's structure over the weeks of abandonment. The most likely explanation, according to maritime experts, was that the MV Lyubov Orlova succumbed to the combined effects of structural failure, weather damage, and flooding. The ship's age, condition, and the severe North Atlantic weather conditions created a perfect storm for catastrophic failure. The emergency beacon activations marked the final moments of a vessel that had served for decades before meeting her end in the cold Atlantic waters. The investigation's findings highlighted the dangers of inadequate preparation in marine towing operations. The Transportation Safety Board issued safety recommendations requiring better planning, equipment testing, and crew training for long-distance towing operations. The case became a textbook example of how a routine maritime operation can become a disaster when proper precautions are not taken. The Kaz II. Some friendships are forged in the quiet suburbs of Perth, where neighbours become family and shared dreams turn into life-changing adventures. Derek Batten, known to his friends as Des, had lived next door to Peter Tunstead for years. Their bond went deeper than proximity. Both men understood the pull of the ocean, the desire to escape the routines of suburban life for something more meaningful. When Des purchased the Kaz II, a 9.8-metre catamaran, in late 2006, he wasn't just buying a boat. He was buying a dream that would include his closest friends. The immediate response to the discovery of the drifting Kaz II came from the Australian Maritime Safety Authority and Queensland Police. On April 20th, 2007, a rescue helicopter spotted the white catamaran drifting 88 nautical miles off the northeastern coast of Australia. The vessel appeared to be in perfect condition, but something felt wrong. The helicopter crew called for immediate assistance, and rescue boats were dispatched to investigate what would become one of Australia's most perplexing maritime mysteries. Derek Batten, 56 years old, was the owner and skipper of the Kaz II. A man who had spent his working life in Perth's building industry, Des had developed a passion for sailing later in life. He wasn't a seasoned mariner, but he had taken sailing courses and was confident in his abilities. Des had purchased the catamaran with a specific goal in mind. He wanted to sail her back to Western Australia, completing a journey that would take him and his friends along Australia's spectacular coastline. The evidence discovered when rescue crews boarded the Kaz II told a story that made no logical sense. The catamaran was found with her engine running, sails partially set, and the table laid for dinner. Plates, cups, and cutlery were arranged as if the crew had been about to eat. The laptop computer was still running, and navigation equipment showed the vessel's position accurately. Everything suggested that the crew had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routine. Peter Tunstead, 69 years old, was Des's neighbour and closest friend. Peter had agreed to join the sailing adventure partly out of loyalty to Des and partly because he believed the journey would be the experience of a lifetime. Despite his age, Peter was in good health and looked forward to the coastal voyage. His wife had initially been concerned about the trip, but Peter assured her that Des was a competent sailor and that the journey would be safe. The methodical presentation of evidence revealed disturbing details about the condition of the Kaz II. The vessel's emergency equipment was largely intact, with life jackets still in their storage compartments. The ship's radio was functional, but no distress calls had been transmitted. Most puzzling was the fact that the vessel's emergency position indicating beacon had been manually activated and then switched off, suggesting that someone had consciously operated the safety equipment. James Tunstead, 63 years old, was Peter's younger brother and the third member of the crew. James had been somewhat reluctant to join the expedition, but family loyalty and his brother's enthusiasm had convinced him to participate. Unlike Des and Peter, James had expressed some concerns about the voyage, particularly about the crew's limited sailing experience. However, he trusted his brother's judgment and believed the coastal route would be relatively safe. Expert witnesses testified about the seaworthiness of the Kaz II and the experience level of her crew. The catamaran was well maintained and equipped with standard safety equipment. However, marine safety experts noted that the three men were relatively inexperienced sailors attempting a challenging coastal voyage. The route from Airlie Beach to Townsville, while scenic, presented navigational challenges that required more experience than the crew possessed. The final known activities of the three men painted a picture of ordinary sailors engaged in routine tasks. The Kaz II had departed Airlie Beach on April 15, 2007, bound for Townsville as part of their planned 8-week journey to Perth. The crew had been in good spirits, looking forward to the coastal voyage. Their last known position was approximately 40 nautical miles northeast of Townsville, where they should have been approaching their destination. The investigation explored multiple competing theories about what happened to the three friends. The first theory suggested a freak accident, possibly involving a sudden emergency that required all three men to enter the water simultaneously. Perhaps they had been trying to retrieve something that had fallen overboard, or they had been swept away by a large wave while working on deck. This theory was supported by the fact that the vessel's emergency beacon had been activated. The second theory focused on the possibility of a medical emergency. Given the age of Peter and James Tunstead, investigators considered whether one or both men might have suffered heart attacks or other health crises that led to a chain of events resulting in all three men going overboard. However, the evidence aboard the Kaz II suggested normal activity right up until the disappearance, with no signs of medical distress. A third theory examined the possibility of piracy or foul play. Some investigators suggested that the three men might have encountered criminals who forced them off the vessel. However, the undisturbed condition of the catamaran, including valuable equipment and personal belongings, made this theory unlikely. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, and there were no signs of struggle or violence aboard the vessel. The most likely explanation, according to maritime experts, involved a combination of inexperience and unfortunate circumstances. The three men may have encountered a situation that required immediate action, such as retrieving a man overboard or dealing with a mechanical problem. Their limited sailing experience might have led to poor decision-making in a crisis situation, resulting in all three men ending up in the water without proper safety equipment. The impact on the Perth sailing community was profound. The disappearance of three well-liked men who had simply wanted to fulfill a sailing dream shocked friends and neighbours. The tragedy highlighted the dangers faced by inexperienced sailors attempting ambitious voyages without proper training or preparation. Sailing schools reported increased enrolment in safety courses following the incident. The families of the missing men faced the unique challenge of grieving without closure. Des Batten's wife had to come to terms with the loss of her husband and the destruction of their retirement plans. The Tunstead family lost two brothers simultaneously, creating a void that could never be filled. The absence of bodies made the grieving process even more difficult, as families struggled to accept that their loved ones were gone. The search and rescue operation that followed the discovery of the Kaz II was extensive and thorough. Australian authorities deployed aircraft, vessels, and personnel to search thousands of square miles of ocean. The search continued for days, with teams examining every piece of floating debris and investigating every possible lead. Despite the massive effort, no trace of the three men was ever found. The investigation's findings led to recommendations for improved safety training for recreational sailors. The case became a textbook example of how inexperience and poor preparation can turn a routine voyage into a tragedy. Maritime safety organisations began emphasising the importance of proper training, safety equipment, and emergency procedures for all sailors, regardless of their intended route. The memory of Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead and James Tunstead lives on in the Perth sailing community and in the continued efforts to improve maritime safety. Their story serves as a reminder that the ocean demands respect and preparation, and that even the most well-intentioned adventures can end in tragedy when proper precautions are not taken. The High Aim 6, In the competitive world of modern commercial fishing, success depends on timing, skill, and the ability to venture into waters where others fear to go. The High Aim 6 represented this harsh reality perfectly. On October 31, 2002, this 80-foot Taiwanese longline fishing vessel departed the port of Liuqiu in southern Taiwan, bound for the rich fishing grounds of the South Pacific. Captain Chen Tai-chen commanded a crew of 12, including Chief Engineer Lee Ardue and 10 Indonesian fishermen. Their mission was straightforward: fill the hold with valuable deep-sea fish and return to port with enough catch to make the dangerous voyage profitable. The discovery came on January 9, 2003, when officers aboard the Australian Navy frigate HMS Adelaide spotted something unusual drifting in the waters off the northern coast of Australia. Through their binoculars, they could see a fishing vessel moving slowly with the current, her engines running, but no sign of life on deck. The ship appeared to be in good condition, riding properly in the water with no obvious damage to her hull or superstructure. Yet something about the scene felt deeply wrong to the experienced naval officers. Captain Chen Tai-chen, 42 years old, was an experienced fisherman who had spent years working the dangerous waters of the South Pacific. He owned a small stake in the High Aim 6 and had invested his life savings in the vessel's fishing operations. Chen was known in Taiwanese fishing circles as a careful captain who took calculated risks, but never endangered his crew unnecessarily. His wife and 2 children waited for him in Taiwan, expecting his return after what should have been a routine fishing expedition. As the Australian naval boarding party approached the High Aim 6, they found themselves entering a scene that would haunt maritime investigators for years. The vessel's engines were running normally, her navigation lights were functioning, and her fishing equipment was properly stowed. In the galley, plates were set on the table as if the crew had been preparing for a meal. Cups of tea sat cold in their saucers, and cooking utensils remained exactly where they had been placed. The scene suggested that whatever happened to the crew occurred suddenly, without warning. Chief Engineer Lee Ardue, 45 years old, was the most experienced crew member after Captain Chen. Lee had worked on fishing vessels for over 20 years and was respected for his ability to keep engines running in the harsh conditions of longline fishing. He had joined the High Aim 6 crew because of his friendship with Captain Chen and his confidence in the vessel's seaworthiness. Lee's technical skills were essential for the success of the fishing operation, as engine failure far from port could prove fatal. The eerie scene aboard the High Aim 6 revealed a ship frozen in time. The crew's personal belongings remained in their quarters, with clothes hanging from hooks and family photographs on small shelves. The ship's logbook showed normal entries up until several weeks before the discovery, with no indication of problems or concerns. Most disturbing was the condition of the fish holds, which contained tons of rotting fish that had been caught weeks earlier. The valuable catch was decomposing, creating an overwhelming stench that made the boarding party's investigation difficult. The 10 Indonesian crew members represented the international nature of modern fishing operations. These men had come to Taiwan seeking work that would allow them to support their families back home. Most were experienced fishermen who had worked on various vessels throughout Southeast Asia. They had signed on with the High Aim 6 because Captain Chen paid fair wages and treated his crew with respect. Their disappearance left families in Indonesia wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The search and rescue operation that followed the discovery was complex and international in scope. Australian authorities coordinated with Taiwanese officials, Indonesian consulates, and international maritime organisations to investigate the crew's disappearance. Search aircraft and vessels scoured thousands of square miles of ocean, looking for signs of the missing 12 men. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of the crew was ever found. The chronology of the High Aim 6's final voyage raised troubling questions. The vessel had left Taiwan on October 31, 2002, but was not discovered until January 9, 2003. This meant the ship had been drifting for over 2 months without her crew. The rotting fish in the hold suggested that the crew had been successfully fishing for several weeks before their disappearance. The timeline indicated that whatever happened to the crew occurred sometime in November or December 2002. Analysis of what went wrong aboard the High Aim 6 focused on several possibilities. The first theory suggested mutiny, with the Indonesian crew members overwhelming the 2 Taiwanese officers. However, investigators found no evidence of violence or struggle aboard the vessel. The crew's personal belongings remained undisturbed, and there were no signs of conflict. The mutiny theory also failed to explain why the entire crew would abandon a seaworthy vessel. The second theory examined the possibility of piracy. The waters where the High Aim 6 was operating were known for pirate activity, and fishing vessels carrying valuable catches were attractive targets. Pirates might have boarded the vessel, taken the crew hostage, and then transferred them to other vessels. However, the undisturbed condition of the ship and the presence of the rotting fish argued against this explanation. A third theory considered the possibility of an accident that required the entire crew to abandon ship. Perhaps a fire, explosion, or severe weather had forced the crew to take to the lifeboats. The ship's engine might have been left running automatically, and the vessel could have drifted for weeks after the crew departed. However, investigators found no evidence of fire, explosion, or significant damage that would have necessitated abandonment. The investigation revealed troubling gaps in the ship's documentation and communication records. The High Aim 6 had not been in regular radio contact with port authorities, making it difficult to determine when the crew disappeared. The ship's fishing license was valid, but there were questions about the vessel's safety equipment and emergency procedures. Some investigators suggested that the crew might have been engaged in illegal fishing activities that led to their disappearance. Phone records from Taiwan provided one of the few clues about the crew's fate. Investigators discovered that someone had made calls from a satellite phone registered to the High Aim 6 several weeks after the vessel was last seen. The calls were made to numbers in Indonesia, suggesting that at least some crew members were alive after the ship's abandonment. However, the calls were too brief to trace, and the satellite phone was never recovered. The impact on the families of the missing crew members was devastating. Captain Chen's wife in Taiwan struggled to understand how her husband and his experienced crew could simply vanish from a seaworthy vessel. The families of the Indonesian crew members faced additional challenges, as language barriers and distance made communication with investigators difficult. Many families never received definitive answers about what happened to their loved ones. The aftermath of the High Aim 6 case led to increased scrutiny of fishing vessel operations throughout the region. Taiwanese authorities implemented new requirements for safety equipment and communication protocols on fishing vessels. The case highlighted the vulnerability of crews working in remote waters, where help might be days or weeks away in an emergency. The SS Valencia, the dawn of the 20th century, brought unprecedented confidence in maritime technology and safety. Steam-powered vessels were conquering the world's oceans, with schedules as reliable as railway timetables. The Pacific Coast Steamship Company epitomized this new age of maritime commerce, operating regular passenger and freight services that connected the growing cities of California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Their vessels carried settlers, businessmen, and families seeking new opportunities in the expanding Pacific Northwest. Into this world of maritime prosperity sailed the SS Valencia, a 598-ton iron-hulled steamer that had served faithfully on the Pacific coast route since 1882. Built in Philadelphia and brought around Cape Horn to her new home waters, the Valencia represented the reliability and comfort that passengers had come to expect from coastal steamers. Her regular run between San Francisco and Seattle had become a vital link in the Pacific Coast transportation network. On January 20th, 1906, Captain Oscar Marcus Johnson prepared the Valencia for what should have been a routine northbound voyage. Johnson, a veteran mariner with 12 years of experience with the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, commanded a crew of 65 and carried 108 passengers. The ship's manifest told the story of early 20th century Pacific Coast society, business travelers, families relocating to growing northern cities, and immigrants seeking new lives in the American and Canadian West. Among the passengers were stories that reflected the hopes and dreams of the era. Charles Bunker, traveling with his wife and 2 children, was relocating his family to Seattle for a new business opportunity. The Bunkers had planned this journey for months, selling their California home and packing their belongings for the move north. Their children, excited about the adventure, had never seen the Pacific Northwest forests their father had described so vividly. Mrs. Sarah McBride, a widow from Oakland, was traveling to Victoria to visit her sister's family. At 58 years old, she had saved for this trip for over a year, looking forward to reuniting with relatives she hadn't seen since before her husband's death. The journey represented both an escape from grief and a chance to rebuild connections with the family members who had moved north during the British Columbia Gold Rush years. The Valencia's crew represented the skilled maritime workforce that made coastal shipping possible. Chief Officer Charles Peterson had worked his way up through the ranks, earning respect for his seamanship and calm demeanour during emergencies. Engineer James Fraser kept the ship's engines running smoothly, while Purser Arthur Connick handled the passenger accommodations with practiced efficiency. These men took pride in their work and had developed the teamwork essential for safe coastal navigation. As the Valencia departed San Francisco on January 20, 1906, the weather was clear and calm. The ship followed her usual route north, staying close to the coast to provide passengers with scenic views of the California and Oregon shorelines. The journey proceeded normally through the first day, with passengers enjoying meals in the dining saloon and relaxing in the comfortable passenger lounges. The crisis began on January 21st when thick fog enveloped the Valencia as she approached the treacherous waters off Cape Flattery. Captain Johnson found himself navigating by dead reckoning, using compass headings and estimated speeds to determine the ship's position. The fog was so dense that visibility dropped to just a few yards, making it impossible to see landmarks or other vessels. Johnson ordered reduced speed, but the pressure to maintain schedule in competitive coastal shipping made delays costly. At 11:30 p.m. on January 22nd, 1906, the Valencia struck the rocks near Pachena Point on Vancouver Island's west coast. The impact threw passengers from their berths and sent crew members scrambling to assess the damage. Captain Johnson immediately ordered distress rockets fired and attempted to back the ship off the rocks, but the Valencia was firmly grounded. The ship's hull had been punctured in multiple places, and water began flooding the lower compartments. The ensuing 36 hours would become one of the most tragic maritime disasters in Pacific Coast history. The Valencia's lifeboats proved inadequate for the rough conditions, with several capsizing in the heavy surf. The ship's position, just 100 meters from shore but trapped against jagged rocks, made rescue nearly impossible. Passengers and crew could see the forest beyond the beach, but the violent waters made reaching safety an almost insurmountable challenge. The human cost of the Valencia disaster was devastating. Of the 173 souls aboard, only 37 survived, all of them men. Every woman and child perished in the disaster, creating a tragedy that would haunt families and communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The victims included entire families like the Bunkers, who had been seeking new opportunities in the north. Charles Bunker survived, but his wife and 2 children died when their lifeboat capsized in the surf. The rescue efforts revealed both heroism and the limitations of early 20th century maritime safety systems. The lighthouse keeper at Cape Beale, Thomas Dakin, organised local rescue attempts using indigenous knowledge and canoes. The crew of the tug Tsar battled massive waves to reach the Valencia, while the steamer Salvor attempted to take survivors off the wreck. Despite these efforts, the combination of rough seas, inadequate equipment, and the ship's dangerous position made rescue operations largely unsuccessful. The impact on Pacific Coast communities was profound. Seattle, which had lost many residents in the disaster, established memorial services and support funds for the victims' families. The tragedy highlighted the dangers of coastal navigation and the need for improved safety equipment and procedures. The Valencia disaster became a catalyst for maritime safety reforms, including better lifeboat requirements and improved communication systems. The investigation that followed the Valencia disaster revealed a pattern of navigation errors and safety deficiencies that had contributed to the tragedy. Captain Johnson had miscalculated his position due to the fog and strong currents, placing the ship far off course. The ship's lifeboats were inadequate for the conditions, and the crew lacked proper training for emergency procedures. These findings led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations. The legacy of the SS Valencia extends far beyond the immediate tragedy. The disaster prompted the establishment of the West Coast Trail, originally built as a life-saving trail for shipwreck survivors. The trail, which still exists today, stands as a monument to the Valencia's victims and a reminder of the dangers faced by early coastal mariners. The tragedy also led to improved lighthouse systems, better navigation equipment, and more rigorous safety training for maritime crews. Local indigenous communities, particularly the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples, played crucial roles in the rescue efforts and in recovering victims' bodies in the months following the disaster. Their knowledge of local waters and conditions proved invaluable, highlighting the importance of traditional maritime knowledge in coastal safety. The collaboration between indigenous rescuers and maritime authorities during the Valencia disaster became a model for future emergency response efforts. The story of the SS Valencia has become part of Pacific Coast maritime legend, with reports of ghost ship sightings persisting for decades after the disaster. In 1933, Valencia's empty lifeboat No. 5 was found drifting in Pachena Bay 27 years after the disaster. Local fishermen reported seeing phantom vessels and hearing mysterious sounds near the wreck site, contributing to the area's reputation as the graveyard of the Pacific. The SS Waratah. The year 1909 marked the height of the Edwardian era's confidence in maritime engineering and the promise of modern passenger travel. The Blue Anchor Line had established itself as a premier operator of passenger and cargo services between Europe and Australia, carrying settlers, businessmen and families seeking opportunities in the growing dominions of the British Empire. Their newest vessel, the SS Waratah, represented the pinnacle of contemporary shipbuilding technology and passenger comfort. On July 26, 1909, at approximately 8:15 p.m, the SS Waratah prepared to depart Durban, South Africa, for what should have been a routine 800-mile voyage to Cape Town. Captain Joshua Ilbery, a veteran mariner with extensive experience in South African waters, commanded the 465-foot steamer. The ship carried 211 passengers and crew members, including families returning to Cape Town after business in Durban, government officials, and maritime workers. The manifest told the story of a thriving colonial economy, wool merchants, mining engineers, and settlers who had built their lives around the shipping routes that connected South Africa to the world. The immediate aftermath of the Waratah's disappearance triggered one of the most extensive search operations in maritime history. When the ship failed to arrive in Cape Town on July 29th as scheduled, port authorities initially assumed a mechanical delay. However, as hours turned to days without any communication, the gravity of the situation became clear. The Union Government of South Africa, in coordination with the Blue Anchor Line and British naval authorities, launched an unprecedented search effort. The evidence methodically presented to investigators painted a picture of a vessel that had simply vanished. The SS Waratah was last positively identified at 6 a.m. on July 27th by officers aboard the SS Clan McIntyre, approximately 150 miles from Durban. The Clan McIntyre's officers reported that the Waratah was maintaining normal speed and appeared to be operating normally. This sighting placed the missing vessel near the mouth of the Bashee River, proceeding southwest toward Cape Town on schedule. The search operations that followed involved multiple government vessels, including HMS Pandora and HMS Forte, which systematically combed the coastline between Durban and Cape Town. The Royal Navy deployed its most experienced officers and latest technology to locate any trace of the missing vessel. Private vessels joined the effort, with the Blue Anchor Line offering substantial rewards for information leading to the discovery of the Waratah, or her passengers and crew. Expert witnesses testified about the Waratah's construction and seaworthiness. Built by Barclay, Curle and Company in Glasgow, the vessel represented modern maritime engineering. Her steel hull was divided into watertight compartments, and she carried the required complement of lifeboats and safety equipment. The ship had successfully completed her maiden voyage from London to Sydney and return, demonstrating her capability to handle long ocean passages. The investigation revealed troubling aspects of the ship's design and operation. Several passengers who had travelled aboard the Waratah on her previous voyage reported that the vessel had an unusual rolling motion, particularly in rough seas. Engineer J.S. Richter, who had sailed on the ship's maiden voyage, testified that the Waratah's stability seemed questionable. He had chosen not to take the return voyage from Durban, citing concerns about the vessel's seaworthiness. The competing theories about the Waratah's fate emerged as investigators analysed the available evidence. The first theory suggested that the ship had encountered a severe storm off the South African coast. Weather records from late July 1909 showed that a significant storm system had passed through the area where the Waratah was last seen. The theory proposed that the vessel had been overwhelmed by heavy seas and sank rapidly, explaining why no distress signals were sent and no debris was found. A second theory focused on structural failure. Some maritime experts suggested that the Waratah's design might have been flawed. making her vulnerable to catastrophic failure in rough conditions. The ship's unusual rolling motion, reported by previous passengers, could have indicated stability problems that became fatal when combined with severe weather. This theory gained support from the fact that the vessel was on only her second voyage, suggesting that design flaws might not have been apparent during initial testing. The third theory examined the possibility of an explosion or fire. The Waratah carried cargo that included flammable materials, and her coal-fired engines presented fire risks. An explosion in the cargo holds or engine room could have destroyed the ship so quickly that there was no time to launch lifeboats or send distress signals. However, the absence of any debris or oil slicks made this theory difficult to prove. The investigation weighed the most likely explanations based on the evidence available. The testimony of the Clan McIntyre's officers established that the Waratah was operating normally at 6 a.m. on July 27th. Weather records showed that conditions deteriorated significantly later that day, with a severe storm developing in the area where the ship was travelling. The combination of the vessel's reported stability problems and the severe weather created conditions that could have led to disaster. The search efforts extended far beyond the initial coastal searches. The Blue Anchor Line chartered additional vessels to examine remote coastlines and offshore areas. Aircraft joined the search when aviation technology became available, providing aerial reconnaissance of vast ocean areas. Despite these efforts, no confirmed wreckage or debris from the Waratah was ever found, making her disappearance one of the most complete vanishing acts in maritime history. The analysis of what went wrong aboard the SS Waratah focused on the combination of design flaws, weather conditions, and operational factors. The ship's stability problems, combined with severe weather and possibly inadequate loading procedures, created a perfect storm for disaster. The fact that the vessel sank so completely, leaving no trace, suggested that the failure was both sudden and catastrophic. The aftermath of the Waratah disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations and ship design standards. The investigation's findings contributed to improved stability requirements for passenger vessels and better weather reporting systems for ships operating in hazardous waters. The Blue Anchor Line implemented new safety procedures and modified their remaining vessels to address the stability concerns identified in the investigation. The legacy of the SS Waratah extends far beyond the immediate tragedy. The ship's disappearance became known as Australia's Titanic, reflecting the magnitude of the loss and the mystery surrounding the vessel's fate. Modern search efforts using advanced sonar and submersible technology continue to search for the wreck, with several claimed discoveries that have yet to be confirmed. The SS Poet. The immediate aftermath of the SS Poet's disappearance triggered one of the most comprehensive maritime investigations in US Coast Guard history. When the 523-foot cargo vessel failed to arrive at Port Said, Egypt, as scheduled in early November 1980, the Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation convened to determine what had happened to the ship and her 34-person crew. The investigation would span months and involve testimony from dozens of witnesses, analysis of weather data, and examination of the ship's construction and loading procedures. The SS Poet had departed Philadelphia at 1:30 a.m. on October the 24th, 1980, carrying 13,500 tons of yellow corn bound for Egypt as part of the Food for Peace program. The ship was operated by Hawaiian Eugenie Corporation under charter to the US government, representing the kind of humanitarian cargo missions that had become routine for American merchant vessels during the Cold War era. The voyage should have taken approximately 2 weeks, following established shipping routes across the North Atlantic. Evidence methodically presented to the Coast Guard investigators painted a picture of a vessel that had simply vanished without a trace. The last confirmed communication from the SS Poet came on October 24th, when the ship reported her position to the Coast Guard as she cleared Delaware Bay. Radio operators at shore stations had attempted to contact the vessel several times in the following days, but received no response. No distress signals were ever transmitted, and no emergency beacons were activated. Expert witnesses testified about the seaworthiness of the SS Poet and her crew's qualifications. Built in 1944 as a Liberty ship, the vessel had been converted for bulk cargo operations and had successfully completed numerous voyages. The ship's master, Captain Eugene Kelly, was an experienced mariner with an unblemished record. The crew included skilled officers and seamen who had sailed together on previous voyages, creating a competent team familiar with the vessel's operations. The investigation interviews revealed crucial details about the ship's loading and departure. Stevedores testified that the corn cargo had been loaded properly, with the holds filled to appropriate levels and the cargo secured according to standard procedures. The ship's stability calculations showed that the Poet was within safe parameters for the voyage. Marine surveyors had inspected the vessel before departure and found no significant problems with her structure or equipment. The competing theories about the Poet's fate emerged as investigators analysed the available evidence. The first theory suggested that the ship had encountered a severe storm and capsized due to cargo shift or stability problems. Weather records from late October 1980 showed that a significant storm system had passed through the North Atlantic during the period when the Poet would have been in the area. The storm featured winds exceeding 70 knots and waves reaching 30 feet, conditions that could overwhelm a heavily loaded cargo vessel. A second theory focused on structural failure. The SS Poet was 36 years old at the time of her disappearance, and some maritime experts suggested that age-related deterioration might have contributed to catastrophic hull failure. The ship's conversion from a Liberty ship to a bulk carrier had involved modifications that might have weakened critical structural elements. However, recent inspections had found no evidence of dangerous structural problems. The third theory examined the possibility of cargo-related disaster. Bulk grain cargoes present unique dangers, including the potential for spontaneous combustion, toxic gas generation, or catastrophic cargo shift. The 13,500 tons of corn in the Poet's holds could have shifted during heavy weather, causing the ship to lose stability and capsize. Alternatively, the cargo might have generated methane gas or other dangerous fumes that could have caused explosion or suffocation of the crew. Weather analysis provided crucial evidence for the investigation. The storm that swept through the North Atlantic on October 25, 26, 1980 was particularly severe, with meteorologists describing it as one of the most intense weather systems of the year. The storm's track placed it directly in the path of the SS Poet's intended route, creating conditions that would have challenged even the most seaworthy vessels. The timing of the storm coincided with the period when the Poet would have been approximately 500 miles southeast of Nova Scotia. The investigation weighed the most likely explanations based on the evidence available. The Coast Guard's final report identified 3 probable causes for the Poet's loss: capsizing due to instability caused by cargo shift, structural failure leading to rapid flooding, or being overwhelmed by the severe storm conditions. The report noted that the ship's age, cargo type, and the timing of the storm created a combination of factors that could have led to disaster. The search and rescue operations that followed the Poet's disappearance were extensive but ultimately unsuccessful. Coast Guard aircraft and vessels searched thousands of square miles of ocean, covering the ship's intended route and areas where debris might have drifted. International maritime organizations coordinated searches along European coastlines, and merchant vessels were alerted to watch for any signs of the missing ship or her crew. The chronology of the final voyage revealed no warning signs of impending disaster. The SS Poet had departed Philadelphia on schedule, with her crew reporting normal conditions during the initial stages of the voyage. The ship's last known position placed her approximately 200 miles southeast of Cape Race, Newfoundland, on October 25th. From that point, the vessel's fate became a matter of speculation and investigation. Analysis of what went wrong focused on the combination of factors that made the Poet vulnerable to disaster. The ship's age, the nature of her cargo, and the severe weather conditions created a perfect storm for catastrophe. The bulk grain cargo was particularly dangerous in heavy seas, as it could shift suddenly and cause the ship to lose stability. The vessel's 36-year-old hull might have been unable to withstand the combination of cargo stress and storm conditions. The aftermath of the SS Poet investigation led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations and procedures. The Coast Guard implemented new requirements for bulk cargo loading, stability calculations, and emergency communication equipment. The case became a catalyst for improved weather routing services and better training for crews handling bulk grain cargoes. The legacy of the SS Poet extends beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about maritime safety and the risks faced by commercial vessels. The 34 crew members who vanished with the ship became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, their fate forever linked to the ghost ship that sailed into history. Their disappearance serves as a reminder of the dangers faced by merchant mariners and the importance of continuous improvements in ship design, safety procedures, and emergency response systems. The MS Munchen. The 1970s represented a revolutionary period in global shipping as the maritime industry embraced new technologies and vessel designs that promised to transform ocean commerce. The development of containerization was reshaping how goods moved across the world's oceans, while innovative ship designs like lash carriers promised to make cargo handling more efficient than ever before. These lighter aboard ship vessels could carry dozens of floating barges, allowing cargo to be loaded and unloaded without the need for conventional port facilities. The MS Munchen embodied this technological optimism. Built in 1972 by Havoltswerke Deutsche Werft in Hamburg, the 261-metre vessel was one of the most advanced lash carriers of her time. At 37,134 gross tons, she could carry 83 floating barges in her massive cargo holds, each barge loaded with goods that could be deployed directly into rivers and coastal waters. The ship represented German engineering at its finest, designed to withstand the harsh conditions of North Atlantic shipping while maintaining the efficiency that modern commerce demanded. The immediate aftermath of the MS Munchen's final radio transmission triggered one of the most extensive maritime investigations in German history. On December 12, 1978, at 6:30 a.m., the ship's radio officer transmitted a distress signal reporting severe weather damage and requesting immediate assistance. The message, sent to Hamburg radio, indicated that the vessel was taking on water and had developed a dangerous list. This would be the last communication ever received from the MS Munchen. Evidence methodically presented to investigators painted a picture of a catastrophic encounter with forces beyond human comprehension. The German Federal Bureau of Maritime Casualty Investigation, working with international maritime authorities, analysed every aspect of the ship's final voyage. Weather records from December 12th showed that the MS Munchen had sailed directly into one of the most severe North Atlantic storms in decades, with winds exceeding 80 knots and waves reaching heights that challenged the limits of measurement. The investigation revealed that Captain Gerd Possel, an experienced mariner with over 20 years of service, had been following established shipping routes when the storm struck. The 28-member crew included skilled officers and engineers who had sailed together on previous voyages, creating a competent team familiar with the vessel's systems. Chief Engineer Klaus Hartwig had reported normal engine operations during the ship's departure from Bremerhaven, and the vessel's maintenance records showed no significant problems. Expert witnesses testified about the MS Munchen's construction and seaworthiness. The ship had been built to the highest standards of the time, with her hull designed to carry the massive loads of lash operations. The vessel's stability calculations showed that she could handle the weight distribution of 83 loaded barges, and her watertight compartments were designed to prevent flooding in normal circumstances. However, the storm the Munchen encountered was far from normal. The investigation's most compelling evidence came from the few pieces of wreckage recovered after the ship's disappearance. Search and rescue operations, involving vessels from multiple nations, found only scattered debris and a single lifeboat that told a disturbing story. The starboard lifeboat, originally mounted 20 meters above the waterline, had been ripped from its mounting brackets with such force that the steel pins were twisted and bent. This evidence suggested that the ship had encountered forces far beyond anything anticipated by her designers. The competing theories about the MS Munchen's fate emerged as investigators analysed the physical evidence and weather data. The first theory suggested that the ship had been overwhelmed by conventional storm waves, with the massive seas causing structural failure and rapid flooding. The vessel's lash design, while innovative, created large open spaces in the cargo holds that might have been vulnerable to water ingress during extreme weather conditions. A second theory focused on the possibility of catastrophic cargo shift. The 83 barges carried by the Munchen were secured by a complex system of guides and restraints, but the extreme motion of the ship in heavy seas might have caused the cargo to break free. The sudden movement of thousands of tons of cargo could have caused the ship to capsize or break apart in minutes, explaining why no further distress signals were transmitted. The most revolutionary theory, however, emerged from analysis of the recovered lifeboat and the extreme nature of the storm. Marine scientists began to consider the possibility that the MS Munchen had encountered what would later be known as a rogue wave or freak wave. These massive, solitary waves, reaching heights of 30 meters or more, were thought to be extremely rare events that occurred when multiple wave systems combined under specific conditions. The investigation weighed these theories against the available evidence and the ship's known characteristics. The twisted mounting hardware on the recovered lifeboat suggested that the Munchen had been struck by a wave of extraordinary power, one that could generate forces far beyond the ship's design parameters. The fact that the lifeboat was found floating free rather than deployed by the crew indicated that the ship's final moments were sudden and catastrophic. Weather analysis provided crucial insights into the conditions that destroyed the MS Munchen. The storm system that struck the North Atlantic on December 12, 1978, was a rare convergence of multiple weather fronts, creating conditions that meteorologists described as once-in-a-century events. The storm generated sustained winds of over 80 knots, with gusts exceeding 100 knots, while wave heights reached 15 meters on average, with individual waves potentially reaching much greater heights. The search and rescue operations that followed the Munchen's disappearance were unprecedented in their scope and intensity. German naval vessels, along with ships from other NATO nations, searched over 100,000 square miles of North Atlantic waters. Aircraft from multiple countries flew thousands of hours of search patterns, while merchant vessels were diverted to assist in the effort. Despite these massive search operations, no survivors were found and only minimal wreckage was recovered. The investigation's findings connected the MS Munchen disaster to similar cases throughout maritime history. The sudden disappearance of large, well-built vessels in severe weather had been documented for centuries, but the Munchen case provided the first scientific evidence that rogue waves might be responsible for these mysterious losses. The case became a catalyst for research into extreme wave phenomena and their effects on ship design. The aftermath of the MS Munchen investigation led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations and ship construction standards. The International Maritime Organization implemented new requirements for weather routing services, emergency communication equipment, and structural design standards for large cargo vessels. The case also spurred research into rogue wave prediction and detection systems that could warn ships of approaching extreme weather conditions. The historical significance of the MS Munchen disaster extends beyond maritime safety into the realm of scientific discovery. The case provided crucial evidence for the existence of rogue waves, phenomena that had been dismissed by many scientists as sailors' myths. The investigation's findings contributed to a new understanding of ocean dynamics and the extreme forces that ships might encounter in severe weather. The legacy of the MS Munchen and her 28 crew members lives on in the continued research into maritime safety and extreme weather phenomena. The ship's disappearance marked a turning point in scientific understanding of ocean waves and their potential for destruction. Captain Possel and his crew became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, but their fate contributed to knowledge that has helped protect countless other mariners from similar disasters. The HMS Hawk. The autumn of 1914 marked a period of profound uncertainty in naval warfare, as the Great War challenged traditional assumptions about maritime combat. The Royal Navy, master of the seas for over a century, found itself facing a new and deadly threat beneath the waves. German U-boats had already demonstrated their lethal capabilities, and the traditional supremacy of surface warships was being questioned by each torpedo that found its mark. The war at sea was evolving into something unprecedented, where invisible enemies could strike without warning and vanish beneath the waves. HMS Hawk represented the confidence of the old naval order. Built at Chatham Dockyard in 1891, the Edgar-class protected cruiser had served the Royal Navy for over 2 decades. At 387 feet in length and displacing 7,350 tons, she was a product of the late Victorian era, designed when naval battles were fought between surface ships in clear sight of each other. Her armour and armament reflected the naval thinking of her time, but by 1914 the rules of naval warfare were changing faster than anyone could have anticipated. The ship's company of HMS Hawk reflected the diverse backgrounds of the Royal Navy's peacetime service. Captain Hugh Powell Evan Tudor Williams, 40 years old, commanded a crew of 594 officers and men. Williams had joined the Royal Navy as a young man, working his way up through the ranks during the peaceful years of the Pax Britannica. His service record showed steady progression through various commands, but nothing had prepared him for the revolutionary warfare that was beginning to unfold in the North Sea. Among the officers serving aboard HMS Hawk was Midshipman John Reginald Kempson, just 17 years old and one of the youngest members of the crew. Born in Leicester in June 1897, Kempson had entered Gresham School as a day student in May 1909 before joining the Royal Navy as a midshipman. His youth and enthusiasm represented the next generation of naval officers, young men who had grown up during the peaceful years of Edward VII's reign and had never experienced the reality of modern naval warfare. The ship's Royal Marines detachment included 78 men under the command of experienced officers who had served in various colonial campaigns. These Marines represented the traditions of the Royal Navy's amphibious forces, men trained for boarding actions and ship-to-shore operations. Their presence aboard HMS Hawk reflected the Navy's expectation that future naval battles would still require the personal courage and seamanship skills that had won victories at Trafalgar and the Nile. The ordinary seamen and stokers who made up the majority of HMS Hawk's crew came from naval ports across the British Isles. Many were career sailors who had joined the Navy during the expansion of the fleet in the early 1900s. Others were reservists called up when war was declared, men who had returned to civilian life but answered the call to serve their country in its hour of need. Their families in Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham, and dozens of smaller communities had watched their sons and husbands depart for what they hoped would be a short, victorious war. On October 15, 1914, HMS Hawk was serving with the 10th Cruiser Squadron, part of the Northern Patrol that enforced the Allied blockade of Germany. The squadron's mission was to intercept merchant vessels attempting to reach German ports, a duty that required continuous patrols in the dangerous waters of the North Sea. The work was monotonous but vital, as the blockade represented one of Britain's most effective weapons against the German war effort. The attack came without warning at 10:30 a.m. as HMS Hawk patrolled approximately 60 miles east of Aberdeen, Scotland. Kapitän-Leutnant Otto Weddigen, commanding the German submarine U-9, had been stalking the British cruiser for hours. Weddigen was already famous in Germany for his previous success in September, when U-9 had sunk 3 Royal Navy cruisers in a single action. Now he had another British warship in his sights, and the opportunity to strike another blow against British naval supremacy. The single torpedo that struck HMS Hawk amidships created a massive explosion that tore through the ship's hull and machinery spaces. The cruiser immediately began to list heavily to starboard, and Captain Williams realised that his ship was doomed. The crew responded with the discipline instilled by years of training, but the speed of the ship's sinking gave them little time to organise an effective evacuation. Within minutes, the order was given to abandon ship. The human cost of the attack was devastating. Of the 594 officers and men aboard HMS Hawk, only 70 survived the sinking. Captain Williams went down with his ship, following the naval tradition that demanded a captain remain with his vessel until the end. Midshipman Kempson, at just 17 years old, was among the 524 men who perished when the cruiser sank. His death, along with that of his shipmates, represented the first generation of young men to die in what would become the bloodiest conflict in human history. The survivors who managed to escape the sinking ship faced the cold waters of the North Sea in October, where hypothermia claimed many lives within minutes. Only one ship's boat was successfully launched, and it was this single boat that carried the 70 survivors to safety. The men who crowded into the overcrowded boat watched helplessly as their shipmates struggled in the water around them, many disappearing beneath the waves within sight of rescue. The impact on families and communities throughout Britain was immediate and profound. The Admiralty's telegram announcing the loss of HMS Hawk brought devastating news to hundreds of families who had believed their loved ones were serving in the relative safety of the Royal Navy. The wives and children of the ship's crew suddenly found themselves widowed and orphaned, facing an uncertain future without their breadwinners and protectors. The loss of HMS Hawk connected to a broader pattern of naval disasters that marked the early months of World War I. The sinking followed the loss of HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue, and HMS Cressy in September, all victims of the same U-boat commander. These losses shocked the Royal Navy and the British public, who had assumed that German submarines posed little threat to major warships. The traditional confidence in British naval supremacy was being shattered by the reality of modern submarine warfare. The historical significance of HMS Hawk's sinking extends beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass the fundamental changes in naval warfare that World War I represented. The age of the battleship and the traditional line of battle was giving way to a new era of submarine warfare, where invisible enemies could strike from below and disappear without trace. The loss of HMS Hawk marked another step in the evolution of naval combat that would continue throughout the war. The memory of Captain Williams and his crew has been preserved in war memorials and naval histories, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. The 524 men who died with HMS Hawk became part of the larger tragedy of World War I, but their individual stories of courage and duty continue to inspire new generations of naval officers and sailors. Their deaths served as a stark reminder of the price of naval service and the dangers faced by those who chose to serve their country at sea. The discovery of HMS Hawk's wreck in recent years has provided new insights into the ship's final moments and the effectiveness of early submarine warfare. The condition of the wreck, found in remarkable preservation on the North Sea floor, serves as a time capsule of Edwardian naval technology and the men who served aboard these vessels. The wreck stands as a monument to the 524 souls who perished, a reminder that the sea keeps its secrets but never forgets the courage of those who sailed upon it. The SS Huitt. On January 20th, 1921, the SS Huitt prepared for departure from Sabine Pass, Texas, carrying a cargo that would prove as dangerous as it was valuable. The 5,000-ton steel-hulled bulk freighter, originally built as the Pacific for the J.S. Emery Steamship Company of Boston, had been purchased by the Union Sulphur Company in 1915 and converted for the specialized task of transporting molten sulfur. Captain Hans Jakob Hansen, one of the company's most experienced mariners, commanded a crew of 42 men as they prepared for what should have been a routine voyage to Portland, Maine. The discovery came not as a dramatic rescue, but as a gradual realization that something had gone terribly wrong. When the SS Huitt failed to arrive at Portland on her scheduled date of February 2nd, Union Sulphur Company officials initially attributed the delay to rough weather or mechanical problems. However, as days passed without any communication from the vessel, concern began to mount. The company's shore managers knew that Captain Hansen was meticulous about maintaining radio contact, and his silence was completely out of character. The SS Huitt represented a specialized branch of maritime commerce that few understood outside the sulfur industry. Built to carry molten sulfur in specially designed tanks, the vessel required careful temperature control and constant monitoring to prevent the cargo from solidifying or creating dangerous gases. The ship's conversion from a general cargo vessel to a sulfur carrier had involved extensive modifications, including the installation of heating systems and specialized pumping equipment that made her unique among American merchant vessels. The eerie nature of the Huitt's disappearance became apparent as investigators began to piece together the vessel's final days. The ship's last radio transmission had been received on January 25th, when she reported her position as approximately 250 nautical miles north of Jupiter Inlet, Florida. The message was routine, confirming the vessel's position and progress northward along the Atlantic coast. Nothing in the transmission suggested any problems or concerns aboard the ship. Captain Hansen's background provided context for the mystery that would unfold. A veteran mariner with over 20 years of experience, Hansen had commanded sulfur carriers for the Union Sulphur Company since 1918. He understood the unique dangers posed by his cargo and had developed procedures for handling emergencies that might arise during sulfur transport. His crew included experienced engineers and deck officers who had worked with sulfur cargoes before, making them among the most qualified men in the dangerous business of transporting molten chemicals. The backstory of the SS Huitt revealed a vessel that had been successfully operating in the sulfur trade for 6 years. Since her conversion in 1915, she had completed dozens of voyages between Texas and East Coast ports, carrying the sulfur that was essential for chemical manufacturing and agricultural applications. The ship's safety record was exemplary, with no significant incidents reported during her service with the Union Sulphur Company. As the investigation into the Huitt's disappearance deepened, the eerie parallels to other maritime mysteries of the period became apparent. The vessel had vanished in the same waters where the Carroll A. Deering had been found, abandoned just days earlier. Both ships had been following similar northbound routes along the Atlantic coast, and both had encountered something that led to the complete disappearance of their crews. The search and rescue operations that followed the Huitt's overdue status were coordinated by the United States Coast Guard, working in conjunction with the Union Sulphur Company's own vessels. Coast Guard cutters systematically searched the vessel's intended route, while company ships examined alternative courses that Captain Hansen might have taken to avoid bad weather. The search covered thousands of square miles of ocean from the Carolina coast to the approaches to Portland Harbor. The theories about what happened to the SS Huitt emerged from analysis of the ship's cargo and the conditions she encountered. The first theory focused on the dangerous nature of molten sulfur transport. If the ship's heating systems had failed, the cargo could have solidified and created dangerous gases that might have killed the crew. Alternatively, if the tanks had been breached, the molten sulfur could have caused fires or explosions that destroyed the vessel. The second theory examined the possibility of structural failure. The Huitt's conversion from a general cargo vessel to a sulfur carrier had involved significant modifications that might have weakened the ship's hull. The constant heating and cooling cycles required for sulfur transport could have caused metal fatigue, leading to catastrophic failure in rough seas. The ship's age and the stresses of specialized cargo operations made structural failure a credible explanation. The investigation also explored the possibility that the Huitt had encountered the same forces that had claimed the Carol A. Deering. Some maritime experts suggested that both ships might have been victims of the same unknown threat, whether natural disaster, piracy, or equipment failure. The timing and location of both disappearances suggested a pattern that investigators struggled to understand. Weather analysis revealed that the SS Huitt had encountered severe storm conditions during her final voyage. A powerful nor'easter had swept up the Atlantic coast during the last week of January 1921, bringing high winds and dangerous seas to the area where the Huitt was travelling. The storm's timing coincided with the ship's last radio transmission, suggesting that weather might have played a role in the vessel's fate. The analysis of what went wrong aboard the SS Huitt focused on the unique dangers of sulfur transport. The cargo's requirement for constant heating made the ship vulnerable to fires and explosions. The toxic gases produced by molten sulfur could have killed the crew if the ventilation systems failed. The ship's specialized equipment created multiple points of failure that could have led to disaster. The aftermath of the Huitt's disappearance had profound implications for the sulfur industry and maritime safety. The Union Sulphur Company implemented new safety procedures for their remaining vessels, including improved communication requirements and enhanced emergency equipment. The Coast Guard developed new guidelines for hazardous cargo transport that were influenced by the lessons learned from the Huitt investigation. The legacy of the SS Huitt and her 42 crew members extends beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass the broader challenges of specialized maritime commerce. The ship's disappearance highlighted the unique dangers faced by vessels carrying hazardous cargoes and the need for specialized safety procedures. Captain Hansen and his crew became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, their fate forever linked to the dangerous cargo that had sustained their livelihoods. The lingering questions about the SS Huitt's fate continue to intrigue maritime historians and investigators. No wreckage was ever found and no survivors were ever rescued. The ship's disappearance remains one of the most complete vanishing acts in maritime history, made even more mysterious by its connection to the Carol A. Deering case. The two vessels, lost within days of each other in the same waters, represent one of the most puzzling periods in American maritime history. The new evidence that has emerged in recent years includes advanced oceanographic studies of the area where the Huitt disappeared. Researchers have identified underwater geological features that might have contributed to the ship's loss, including deep ocean trenches where wreckage could remain hidden forever. However, the mystery of what happened to Captain Hansen and his crew remains unsolved, ensuring that the SS Huitt's story continues to captivate those who study the sea's enduring mysteries. The SS Copenhav, the immediate aftermath of the SS Copenhaven's final radio transmission, created a crisis that would consume the Danish maritime establishment for years to come. When the training ship failed to arrive at her scheduled destination in Australia, the Danish East Asiatic Company launched one of the most extensive maritime investigations in the nation's history. The company's officials, along with Danish government authorities, struggled to understand how their flagship training vessel, the world's largest sailing ship at the time, could simply vanish without a trace. Evidence methodically presented to investigators painted a picture of a vessel that had been operating normally right up until her disappearance. The last radio message, transmitted on December 22, 1928, had been routine in nature, with Captain Hans Ferdinand Andersen reporting the ship's position and expected arrival time. Nothing in the transmission suggested any problems or concerns aboard the 5-masted bark that had been carrying 75 souls across the South Atlantic. The investigation interviews revealed the devastating human impact of the Copenhaven's disappearance. Among the 45 cadets aboard the vessel was Cadet Mogens Schack, age 19, from Copenhagen. His father, a successful merchant, had enrolled his son in the maritime training program with dreams of naval service. Mogens had written to his family just days before the ship's disappearance, describing the excitement of rounding Cape Horn and the challenge of working the great vessel's towering sails. Cadet Eric Lindgren, 20 years old, came from a family of fishermen in Jutland. His parents had scraped together the money to pay for his training aboard the Copenhagen, seeing it as an opportunity for their son to escape the hard life of coastal fishing. Eric's letters home described the discipline and camaraderie of life aboard the training ship, and his growing confidence in his abilities as a sailor. His mother would keep his last letter, written from Buenos Aires, for the rest of her life. The 26 professional crew members included Chief Officer Jens Rasmussen, a veteran sailor who had served as an instructor to hundreds of cadets during his career. At 45 years old, Rasmussen was respected throughout the Danish maritime community for his ability to teach young men the skills and discipline required for naval service. His wife and 3 children in Copenhagen waited anxiously for news when the ship failed to arrive on schedule. Captain Hans Ferdinand Andersen, 52 years old, was one of Denmark's most experienced sailing ship commanders. He had commanded the Copenhagen since 1924 and had successfully completed numerous training voyages without incident. His expertise in handling large sailing vessels made him the natural choice to command the world's largest sailing ship. Andersen's reputation for safety and seamanship made his vessel's disappearance all the more shocking to the Danish maritime community. The competing theories about the Copenhagen's fate emerged as investigators analysed the available evidence. The first theory suggested that the ship had encountered a severe storm and capsized due to the instability inherent in large sailing vessels. The Copenhagen's massive size, while impressive, created enormous forces when the ship heeled in heavy weather. Some maritime experts suggested that the vessel might have been overwhelmed by a combination of wind and sea that exceeded her design parameters. The second theory focused on the possibility of collision with an iceberg. The ship's intended route took her through waters where icebergs were occasionally reported, and the summer season in the Southern Ocean sometimes brought ice further north than usual. An iceberg collision could have caused catastrophic damage to the ship's hull, leading to rapid sinking with no opportunity to send distress signals. The investigation examined the possibility of structural failure. The Copenhagen was built in 1921 by Ramage and Ferguson in Leith, Scotland, and represented the latest in sailing ship technology. However, the vessel's enormous size created stresses that were not fully understood at the time. The ship's 5 masts and massive sail plan generated forces that could have exceeded the structural limits of her steel hull and rigging. Weather analysis provided crucial evidence for the investigation. Records from December 1928 showed that the South Atlantic had experienced several severe storm systems during the period when the Copenhagen was crossing from Buenos Aires to Australia. These storms featured winds exceeding 60 knots and waves reaching 15 meters in height, conditions that would have challenged even the most seaworthy vessel. The investigation weighed the most likely explanations based on the evidence available. The ship's last known position placed her in waters where severe weather was common, and the timing of her disappearance coincided with the passage of a major storm system. The combination of the vessel's size, the challenging weather conditions, and the inherent dangers of sailing ship operations created conditions where disaster was possible. The impact on families and communities throughout Denmark was profound. The loss of 45 young cadets represented a tragedy that touched families across the nation. The Danish Maritime Academy, which had sent these young men to sea, faced questions about the safety of training aboard such large vessels. The families of the cadets struggled to understand how their sons could simply vanish in the modern age of radio communication and steam-powered rescue vessels. The search operations that followed the Copenhagen's disappearance were extensive but ultimately futile. Ships from multiple nations scoured the South Atlantic, searching for any trace of the missing vessel. The British Royal Navy contributed vessels to the search, while merchant ships were alerted to watch for debris or survivors. Despite these efforts, no confirmed wreckage was ever found, making the Copenhagen's disappearance one of the most complete vanishing acts in maritime history. The aftermath of the investigation led to significant changes in sail training operations. The Danish Maritime Authority implemented new safety requirements for training vessels, including improved radio equipment and more frequent position reports. The loss of the Copenhagen marked the end of an era in maritime training, as nations began to question the wisdom of sending young men to sea aboard large sailing vessels. The legacy of the SS Copenhav extends far beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about maritime education and the risks faced by training vessels. The 75 souls who vanished with the ship became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, their fate forever linked to the ghost ship that represented the pinnacle of sailing ship technology. Captain Anderson and his crew, along with the 45 cadets in their care, became symbols of the dangers faced by those who chose to serve at sea. The MV Taiqing 21. The discovery came at dawn on November 9, 2008, when the crew of the Japanese fishing vessel Satsuma Maru spotted something unusual drifting in the vast Pacific waters near Kiribati. At first glance, it appeared to be just another vessel working the same fishing grounds, but as they approached, the scene became increasingly disturbing. The 50-ton Taiwanese fishing vessel MV Taiqing 21 floated motionless on the gentle swells, her hull blackened and scorched, her superstructure twisted by intense heat. Most unsettling of all, there was no sign of life aboard the burnt-out shell that had once been a working fishing boat. The immediate aftermath of the discovery triggered a massive search and rescue operation, coordinated by the governments of Taiwan, New Zealand, and Kiribati. The Taiwan Fisheries Agency, in conjunction with the New Zealand Rescue Coordination Centre, launched one of the largest maritime search operations in recent Pacific history. The discovery of the abandoned and fire-damaged vessel raised immediate concerns about the fate of the 10 crew members who had been aboard when the ship's last radio transmission was received on October 28th. Evidence methodically presented to investigators painted a picture of catastrophic fire damage that had swept through the vessel. The Taiqing 21's hull remained intact below the waterline, but everything above had been consumed by flames of extraordinary intensity. The ship's bridge had been completely destroyed, with metal fixtures melted and twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The crew quarters showed evidence of extreme heat damage, with aluminum fittings fused and steel structures warped beyond recognition. The investigation revealed that the MV Taiqing 21 had been operating as a longline fishing vessel, working the remote waters of the Central Pacific where tuna and other deep-sea species could be caught in large quantities. The vessel had departed from Taiwan in early October 2008, following established fishing routes that took her far from land into some of the most isolated waters on Earth. The ship's crew included Captain Lin Wei Ming, a veteran fisherman with over 20 years of experience, and 9 crew members from Taiwan and Indonesia. The eerie scene aboard the abandoned vessel told a story of sudden disaster. The ship's 3 life rafts were missing, along with the single lifeboat that had been mounted on the stern. This evidence suggested that the crew had attempted to abandon ship during the fire, but their fate remained unknown. The ship's emergency radio beacon had not been activated, indicating that the crisis developed too quickly for the crew to send distress signals. The backstory of the MV Taiqing 21 revealed a typical example of the modern Pacific fishing fleet. Built in 1987, the vessel was one of thousands of longline fishing boats that worked the remote waters of the Pacific Ocean. These vessels operated far from shore for weeks or months at a time, catching tuna, swordfish, and other valuable species that were then transported to markets throughout Asia. The dangerous nature of this work made accidents common, but complete disappearances were rare. Expert witnesses testified about the likely cause of the fire that had destroyed the fishing vessel. Marine safety investigators suggested that the blaze might have started in the engine room, where diesel fuel and hydraulic fluids could have ignited due to mechanical failure or electrical problems. The intensity of the fire, evidenced by the extensive damage to the ship's superstructure, suggested that the crew had little time to fight the flames before being forced to abandon ship. The competing theories about the crew's fate emerged as the investigation progressed. The first theory suggested that the crew had successfully abandoned ship in the life rafts and lifeboat, but had been unable to survive in the remote Pacific waters. The nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and the crew's chances of rescue in such isolated waters were minimal. Weather conditions during late October 2008 had been challenging, with rough seas and strong winds that could have overwhelmed small survival craft. The second theory examined the possibility that the crew had perished in the fire before they could abandon ship. The rapid spread of the flames, combined with the production of toxic smoke, might have trapped the crew below decks. However, the missing life rafts and lifeboats suggested that at least some crew members had survived the initial fire and attempted to escape in the survival craft. The investigation weighed the most likely explanations based on the physical evidence and the known dangers of Pacific fishing operations. The complete absence of the crew, combined with the missing survival equipment, strongly suggested that the men had abandoned ship during the fire. The fact that their bodies were never found, despite extensive search operations, indicated that they had likely perished at sea after leaving the burning vessel. The search operations that followed the discovery of the Taiqing 21 were unprecedented in their scope and duration. Aircraft from New Zealand, Australia, and the United States flew thousands of hours of search patterns, covering over 21,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean. Ships from multiple nations joined the effort, systematically searching the waters where the crew's survival craft might have drifted. Despite these massive efforts, no trace of the 10 missing men was ever found. The aftermath of the investigation led to increased scrutiny of safety procedures aboard Pacific fishing vessels. The Taiwan Fisheries Agency implemented new requirements for emergency communication equipment and survival gear. The case highlighted the unique dangers faced by crews working in the remote Pacific, where help might be thousands of miles away when disaster strikes. The theories about what caused the fire aboard the MV Taiqing 21 continued to evolve as investigators analysed the evidence. Some experts suggested that the vessel's diesel fuel systems might have failed, creating conditions where a spark could ignite a catastrophic blaze. Others pointed to the ship's electrical systems, which were subjected to the corrosive effects of salt water and the constant vibration of long-line fishing operations. The lingering questions about the fate of the 10 crew members remain unanswered to this day. The men who vanished from the Taiqing 21 became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, their disappearance serving as a reminder of the dangers faced by those who work the world's most remote waters. The burnt-out hull of their vessel was eventually towed back to Taiwan, where it stands as a monument to the courage and sacrifice of commercial fishermen. New evidence continues to emerge about the conditions that led to the Taiqing 21 disaster. Advanced fire investigation techniques have provided insights into how quickly fires can spread aboard fishing vessels, while improved survival equipment has been developed to help crews survive in remote Pacific waters. However, the mystery of what happened to Captain Lin and his crew remains unsolved, ensuring that their story continues to resonate with those who understand the dangers of life at sea. The USS Cyclops. The spring of 1918 represented a pivotal moment in the First World War, as the United States Navy struggled to maintain supply lines across submarine-infested waters. The German U-boat campaign had reached its peak of effectiveness, with merchant vessels disappearing at an alarming rate throughout the Atlantic. American naval colliers like the USS Cyclops formed the backbone of the war effort, carrying essential materials between South America and North American ports under the constant threat of torpedo attack. The USS Cyclops embodied the industrial might that America brought to the Great War. Launched in 1910 by William Cramp and Sons in Philadelphia, the 542-foot naval collier was designed to carry over 10,000 tons of cargo in her massive holds. Originally built to transport coal to fuel the Navy's steam-powered fleet, the Cyclops had been modified to handle various bulk cargoes essential to the war effort. Her twin steam engines and reinforced hull made her one of the most capable cargo vessels in the American fleet. The immediate aftermath of the USS Cyclops' disappearance triggered the largest peacetime search operation in US Navy history. When the collier failed to arrive at Baltimore on March 13, 1918, as scheduled, Navy officials initially assumed she had been delayed by mechanical problems or rough weather. However, as days passed without any radio contact, the gravity of the situation became clear. The Office of Naval Intelligence launched a comprehensive investigation that would continue for decades. Evidence methodically presented to investigators painted a picture of a vessel that had simply vanished without a trace. The Cyclops' last confirmed position was transmitted on March 4, 1918, as she departed Barbados bound for Baltimore. The ship carried 10,800 tons of manganese ore, a mineral essential for steel production and the war effort. Her crew of 306 included experienced naval personnel and civilian workers, all under the command of Lieutenant Commander George Washington Worley. The investigation interviews revealed troubling details about the ship's condition and her commanding officer. Lieutenant Commander Worley, a German-born naturalized American citizen, had been the subject of complaints from his crew. Several officers had signed a petition alleging that Worley was unfit for command, citing his heavy drinking and erratic behaviour. The Office of Naval Intelligence had investigated these allegations, but found no evidence of sabotage or treason. Expert witnesses testified about the seaworthiness of the USS Cyclops and the nature of her cargo. Naval architects noted that the ship's design made her vulnerable to structural stress when carrying dense cargoes like manganese ore. The vessel's single bottom and the placement of her cargo holds created conditions where shifting cargo could cause catastrophic instability. The manganese ore, with its high density and tendency to shift in rough seas, presented unique challenges for the ship's stability. The competing theories about the Cyclops' fate emerged as investigators analysed the available evidence. The first theory suggested that the ship had been sunk by a German submarine. Given the intensity of the U-boat campaign in early 1918, this seemed the most logical explanation. However, German naval records examined after the war showed no submarine attacks on vessels matching the Cyclops' description during the relevant time period. The second theory focused on the possibility of structural failure. The Cyclops had been experiencing engine problems, with her starboard engine inoperative due to a cracked cylinder. Operating on only one engine placed additional stress on the ship's structure and made her more vulnerable to the forces generated by heavy cargo in rough seas. Some experts suggested that the combination of structural stress and the dense manganese ore cargo could have caused catastrophic failure. The investigation explored the possibility of cargo shift as the cause of the disaster. The 10,800 tons of manganese ore in the ship's holds could have shifted during heavy weather, causing the vessel to lose stability and capsize. This theory gained credibility from the fact that the Cyclops had no experience carrying ore cargo, and her crew might not have been familiar with the special precautions required for such dense materials. Weather analysis provided crucial evidence for the investigation. Records from March 1918 showed that the North Atlantic had experienced severe storm conditions during the period when the Cyclops would have been travelling from Barbados to Baltimore. These storms featured high winds and large waves that could have created conditions leading to cargo shift or structural failure. The timing of the weather systems coincided with the ship's expected position along her route. The investigation weighed the most likely explanations based on the evidence available. The combination of mechanical problems, dangerous cargo, and severe weather created conditions where disaster was possible. The ship's design flaws, particularly her vulnerability to cargo shift, made her susceptible to sudden loss of stability. The absence of any distress signals suggested that whatever happened to the Cyclops occurred quickly and without warning. The aftermath of the investigation led to significant changes in naval cargo handling procedures and ship design standards. The Navy implemented new requirements for carrying dense cargoes, including improved securing systems and stability calculations. The loss of the Cyclops became a catalyst for research into ship stability and cargo handling that would benefit future maritime operations. The case of the USS Cyclops connected to a broader pattern of mysterious ship disappearances during and after World War I. The vessel's sister ships, USS Proteus and USS Nerius, would later disappear under similar circumstances, suggesting design flaws that made the entire class vulnerable to catastrophic failure. These losses highlighted the dangers of rushing wartime construction and the need for thorough testing of new ship designs. The historical significance of the USS Cyclops extends beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about naval logistics and the risks faced by merchant vessels during wartime. The 306 souls who vanished with the ship represented the largest non-combat loss of life in US Navy history, a record that stands to this day. Their disappearance serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who kept supply lines open during the Great War. The legacy of the USS Cyclops and her crew continues to influence maritime safety and naval operations. The lessons learned from her disappearance contributed to improved ship design, better cargo handling procedures, and enhanced safety protocols that have saved countless lives. Lieutenant Commander Worley and his crew became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, but their fate contributed to knowledge that has protected future generations of sailors. The search for the USS Cyclops continues to this day, with modern technology offering new possibilities for locating the wreck. Advanced sonar systems and deep-sea exploration capabilities have reopened the investigation, providing hope that the mystery of the Cyclops might finally be solved. However, the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and the passage of over a century have made the search increasingly difficult, ensuring that the ship's fate remains one of the sea's most enduring puzzles. The MV Taiqing. The first sign of something unusual came through the radio crackle of a routine surveillance flight. At 2:30 p.m. on March 24, 2006, the pilot of an Australian Coast Watch aircraft was conducting standard patrols over the Gulf of Carpentaria when he spotted a vessel drifting approximately 180 kilometres southwest of Waipa, Queensland. Through his binoculars, he could see an 80-metre tanker moving slowly with the current, but something immediately struck him as wrong. The ship appeared to be abandoned, with no signs of life on deck and no response to radio calls. The immediate aftermath of the discovery set in motion a coordinated response involving multiple Australian government agencies. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority worked with Australian Customs to organise a boarding party, while the Australian Federal Police prepared to investigate what could be anything from a routine abandonment to international crime. The vessel's presence in Australian waters without proper documentation or crew raised immediate concerns about smuggling, illegal fishing, or worse. Evidence methodically presented to investigators revealed a ship that had been deliberately stripped of identifying information. When the boarding party reached the vessel on March 25th, they found themselves walking through what appeared to be a ghost ship prepared for abandonment. The vessel bore the name Taiqing on her hull, but all other identifying marks had been systematically removed. Ship's papers, registration documents, and crew manifests were completely absent. The eerie scene that confronted the boarding party defied easy explanation. The ship's bridge contained no navigation equipment, no radio gear, and no personal belongings. The crew quarters were empty, with no clothes, photographs, or personal items that might identify the missing crew. Most disturbing was the ship's galley, which contained a large quantity of rice but no indication of recent human activity. Plates and utensils were clean and stored, as if the ship had been abandoned for an extended period. The backstory that emerged painted a picture of a vessel operating outside normal maritime commerce. The broken tow rope trailing from the bow suggested that the Taiqing had been under tow when she broke free, but from where and by whom remained a mystery. The ship's engines were inoperable, indicating that she'd been dependent on external power for movement. Her design and cargo capacity suggested she might have been used as a supply vessel for fishing fleets operating in international waters. The investigation interviews with maritime experts revealed the unusual nature of the discovery. Australian Customs spokesman Matt Wardle described the systematic removal of identifying information as highly unusual. It appeared to have been stripped clean, he stated. The name of the vessel is its only identifying feature, and that is not a lot to go on. We don't even know where it is registered, if indeed it has been registered at all. The theories that emerged focused on the vessel's possible role in illegal fishing operations. The first theory suggested that the Taiqing had been used as a mothership to supply fishing vessels operating illegally in Australian waters. The large quantity of rice found aboard supported this theory, as did the ship's size and configuration. When authorities began closing in on the illegal operation, the theory proposed, the ship was deliberately abandoned to avoid prosecution. The second theory examined the possibility of people smuggling. The Gulf of Carpentaria's remote location made it an attractive target for smugglers attempting to land people in Australia without detection. The ship's size and design would have made it suitable for carrying large numbers of people. while its abandonment could have been a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence of illegal activities. The investigation explored the possibility that the Jianseng had been involved in drug trafficking. The systematic removal of identifying information and the presence of the broken tow rope suggested that the vessel had been part of a sophisticated criminal operation. Drug traffickers often used motherships to transport narcotics across international waters, transferring them to smaller vessels for final delivery. Expert witnesses testified about the challenges of identifying vessels that had been deliberately stripped of documentation. Maritime safety authorities noted that the practice of removing identifying marks was common among vessels engaged in illegal activities. The ship's condition suggested that whoever had abandoned her had taken considerable time to ensure that her origins and purpose could not be easily determined. The competing theories were weighed against the physical evidence found aboard the vessel. The absence of violence or signs of struggle suggested that the abandonment had been planned rather than the result of an emergency. The clean condition of the ship and the organised storage of supplies indicated that the crew had left voluntarily, taking their personal belongings with them. Weather analysis for the period leading up to the discovery showed that the Gulf of Carpentaria had experienced normal conditions, ruling out storm damage or weather-related abandonment. The ship's position when found suggested that she'd been drifting for several days or weeks, carried by prevailing currents from somewhere to the north or west. The investigation revealed connections to similar cases in the region. The Jianseng was the second ghost ship to appear in Australian waters in recent years, following the 2003 discovery of the Taiwanese fishing vessel High-Aim 6. Both vessels had been found without crews and with minimal identifying information, suggesting a pattern of deliberate abandonment. The aftermath of the investigation led to increased surveillance of remote Australian waters and enhanced cooperation between maritime agencies. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority implemented new procedures for dealing with abandoned vessels, while customs officials developed improved methods for tracking vessels that might be involved in illegal activities. The lingering questions about the MV Jianseng's origins and crew remain unanswered to this day. Despite extensive investigations by multiple agencies, the ship's nationality, port of registry, and crew composition were never determined. The vessel was eventually removed from Australian waters, but the mystery of her purpose and the fate of her crew continues to intrigue maritime investigators. New evidence about the global nature of illegal fishing operations has provided context for the Jianseng case, suggesting that she may have been part of a larger network of vessels operating outside international law. However, the specific details of her mission and the circumstances of her abandonment remain hidden beneath the waves of bureaucratic investigation and international maritime law, ensuring that the ghost ship keeps her secrets while raising new questions about the hidden world of illegal maritime activities. The USS Proteus. By November 1941, the world stood on the precipice of total war. The United States Navy, still officially neutral but increasingly committed to supporting Britain's war effort, found itself managing a complex web of military and civilian shipping operations. The Lend-Lease program had transformed American ports into vital supply centers, while the Caribbean Sea had become a crucial corridor for raw materials essential to the Allied war machine. Into this dangerous environment sailed vessels that had been hastily converted from their original military purposes to serve the urgent needs of wartime commerce. The USS Proteus represented both the ingenuity and the desperation of American naval planning in 1941. Originally launched in 1912 as a Proteus-class collier designed to carry coal to fuel the Navy's steam-powered fleet, the 19 360-ton vessel had been sold to Canadian interests on March 8, 1941. The ship's conversion to civilian bauxite transport reflected the urgent need for aluminum production, as the lightweight metal had become essential for aircraft manufacturing. Her sister ship, the USS Cyclops, had already vanished mysteriously in 1918, but the demand for bauxite transport overshadowed concerns about the class's troubled history. On November 23, 1941, the Proteus departed St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands with a full cargo of bauxite ore bound for Portland, Maine. Captain W.H. Miller commanded a crew of 58 men, including both Canadian and American mariners, who'd signed on for what should have been a routine cargo run. The ship's holds contained approximately 9,000 tons of bauxite, the aluminum-rich ore that would be processed into metal for Allied aircraft production. The cargo represented millions of dollars in essential war materials, making the voyage both economically and strategically vital. The voyage began under favourable conditions, with clear weather and calm seas as the Proteus cleared the Virgin Islands and headed north into the Atlantic shipping lanes. The ship's route would take her through waters that had become increasingly dangerous due to German U-boat activity, but the area near the Caribbean was still considered relatively safe compared to the mid-Atlantic convoy routes. Captain Miller maintained regular radio contact with shore stations, reporting his position and progress according to established procedures. The chronology of the Proteus's final voyage reveals a pattern that would become tragically familiar. The ship's last confirmed radio transmission was received on November 23rd, shortly after her departure from St. Thomas. The message was routine, confirming the vessel's position and expected arrival time in Portland. Nothing in the transmission suggested any problems or concerns aboard the ship, and weather conditions along the intended route remained favourable for navigation. As days passed without further communication, concern began to mount among shipping officials and the families of the crew. The Proteus was equipped with modern radio equipment and had maintained regular contact schedules on previous voyages. Captain Miller's failure to report his position was completely out of character for an experienced mariner who understood the importance of maintaining communication during wartime conditions. The search and rescue operations that followed were complicated by the international nature of the shipping arrangement and the wartime restrictions on vessel movements. The US Coast Guard coordinated with Canadian authorities to organise search efforts, while the Royal Canadian Navy provided additional vessels and aircraft. The search area covered thousands of square miles of ocean, from the Caribbean to the approaches to the Maine coast. The investigation revealed troubling parallels to the earlier loss of the USS Cyclops. Both ships were members of the same class. Both had been carrying dense mineral cargoes, and both had vanished without sending distress signals. The Proteus-class design featured a unique structural arrangement, with a steel framework running the length of the ship to support the cargo handling equipment. This design, while innovative for its time, created potential weak points that might have been vulnerable to the stresses of carrying heavy cargoes. The analysis of what went wrong focused on several interconnected factors. The ship's age, combined with the stresses of carrying dense bauxite cargo, might have led to structural failure. The Proteus had been in service for nearly 30 years, and the constant loading and unloading of heavy cargoes could have caused metal fatigue in critical structural components. The conversion from a coal-carrying collier to a bauxite transport might have placed unexpected stresses on the ship's hull and framework. Weather analysis revealed that the North Atlantic had experienced rough conditions during the period when the Proteus would have been travelling northward. While not extreme by the standards of the region, the combination of heavy seas and the ship's dense cargo could have created dangerous conditions. The bauxite ore, while lighter than the manganese carried by the Cyclops, was still significantly heavier than the coal for which the ship had been originally designed. The aftermath of the Proteus investigation led to increased scrutiny of vessel conversions and cargo handling procedures. The Canadian and American authorities implemented new requirements for structural inspections and stability calculations when converting military vessels to civilian use. The case highlighted the dangers of using aging warships for purposes beyond their original design parameters. The legacy of the USS Proteus extends far beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about wartime shipping and the risks faced by merchant mariners. The 58 crew members who vanished with the ship became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, their fate forever linked to the flawed design of the Proteus-class vessels. The ship's disappearance occurred just 2 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, making her crew among the last peacetime casualties of a conflict that would soon engulf the world. The pattern established by the Proteus-class disappearances would continue with tragic consistency. The ship's sister vessel, USS Nerius, would vanish under similar circumstances just 3 weeks later, carrying another cargo of bauxite and another crew of experienced mariners. The loss of 3 out of 4 ships in the class represented one of the most complete maritime disasters in naval history, suggesting fundamental flaws in the vessel's design that made them vulnerable to catastrophic failure. The USS Nerius, the immediate aftermath of the USS Nerius's failure to arrive at her destination, created a crisis that would consume Canadian and American maritime authorities for months. when the vessel failed to reach Halifax, Nova Scotia on December 20th, 1941, the Aluminum Company of Canada officials faced a devastating realization. Their second ship in less than a month had vanished without a trace. The company's management, already reeling from the loss of the Proteus just 3 weeks earlier, now confronted the possibility that their entire bauxite transport operation was fatally flawed. Evidence methodically presented to investigators revealed an eerie pattern that defied logical explanation. The USS Nerius, like her sister ship Proteus, had departed St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands with a full cargo of bauxite ore and an experienced crew. Captain John Thomas Bennett had transmitted his final radio message on December 10th, 1941, reporting normal conditions and confirming his expected arrival in Halifax. The transmission was routine, professional, and gave no indication of the disaster that would follow. The investigation interviews revealed the human cost of what was becoming a maritime catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Expert witnesses testified that the loss of 2 identical ships under similar circumstances suggested fundamental design flaws in the Proteus-class vessels. Naval architects noted that the ship's age, combined with the stresses of carrying dense bauxite cargo, created conditions where catastrophic failure became increasingly likely with each voyage. Among the 61 crew members who vanished with the Nerius were men whose stories reflected the diverse nature of wartime maritime service. Clarence Keldon Cleveland, born on October 18, 1916, in Gaspereau, Kings County, Nova Scotia, was just 25 years old when he signed aboard the Nerius. The son of Edwin Dadmond Cleveland and Alice Gertrude Jordan of Canning, Nova Scotia, Clarence had grown up in the Annapolis Valley, where his family had farmed for generations. His decision to go to sea represented both economic opportunity and a desire to serve the war effort. Edward Norman Fitzmaurice, born on January 1, 1918, came from Bedford, Halifax County, Nova Scotia. At 23 years old, he was the son of Charles Thomas Fitzmaurice and Florence Millie Mosher. Edward's family had suffered tragedy when his mother died in 1923, leaving his father to raise the children alone. Edward's decision to join the crew of the Nerius provided steady income that helped support his family during the difficult years of the Great Depression. Walter Patrick Gabriel left behind a brother, Grant Joseph Gabriel, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The two brothers had been close, and Walter's decision to sail with the Nerius was motivated by the good wages offered by the Aluminum Company of Canada. The bauxite trade had become essential to the Allied war effort, and crew members were paid premium wages to compensate for the dangers of sailing in submarine-infested waters. Basil Morris Harvey was born on June 4, 1920, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. At just 21 years old, he was the son of Frederick Cochrane, Harvey and Mabel Blanche Hines of Armdale, Nova Scotia. Basil's youth made him one of the youngest crew members aboard the Nerius, but his eagerness to serve and his strong work ethic had earned him respect among the veteran sailors who made up the majority of the crew. Clarence Howard Monroe, born on October 1, 1908, was a married man from Guysborough, Nova Scotia. The son of Harvey Stanley Monroe and Charlotte Elizabeth Conrad, Clarence had left behind his wife Muriel in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. At 33 years old, he was one of the more experienced crew members, and his decision to sail with the Nerius was driven by the need to provide for his family during wartime. The competing theories about the Nerius's fate emerged as investigators struggled to understand how 3 ships of the same class could vanish under similar circumstances. The first theory suggested that German U-boats had sunk both the Proteus and the Nerius, but extensive searches of German naval records after the war revealed no submarine attacks corresponding to the times and locations of the disappearances. The second theory focused on structural failure caused by the combination of age, cargo weight, and design flaws. The Nerius was nearly 30 years old when she disappeared, and the constant loading and unloading of heavy bauxite cargo could have caused metal fatigue in critical structural components. The ship's conversion from a coal-carrying collier to a bauxite transport might have placed unexpected stresses on the hull and framework. The investigation examined weather conditions during the period when the Nerius would have been travelling from St. Thomas to Halifax. December 1941 had brought rough seas and strong winds to the North Atlantic, creating conditions that could have been dangerous for an aging vessel carrying a dense cargo. The combination of heavy weather and the ship's structural vulnerabilities might have created a perfect storm for disaster, The aftermath of the Nerius investigation led to the immediate suspension of the remaining Proteus-class vessels from bauxite transport service. The Aluminum Company of Canada was forced to find alternative shipping arrangements, while Canadian and American authorities implemented new safety requirements for vessels carrying heavy cargoes. The case highlighted the dangers of using aging warships for purposes beyond their original design parameters. The impact on families and communities throughout Nova Scotia was profound. The loss of 5 Nova Scotian crew members aboard the Nerius created a wave of grief that swept through the maritime provinces. Clarence Cleveland's family in Canning mourned the loss of their son, while Edward Fitzmaurice's relatives in Bedford struggled to understand how their loved one could simply vanish without a trace. The search operations that followed the Nerius's disappearance were extensive but ultimately futile. Canadian naval vessels and aircraft searched thousands of square miles of Atlantic waters, while merchant ships were alerted to watch for debris or survivors. The Royal Canadian Navy coordinated with American authorities to examine alternative routes that the ship might have taken, but no trace of the vessel or her crew was ever found. The legacy of the USS Nerius and her crew extends far beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about maritime safety and the risks faced by merchant mariners during wartime. The 61 souls who vanished with the ship became part of the ocean's eternal mystery, their fate forever linked to the flawed design of the Proteus-class vessels. Captain Bennett and his crew, along with the Nova Scotian sailors who had answered the call to serve, became symbols of the hidden costs of wartime mobilization. The MV Stella Daisy. The immediate aftermath of the MV Stella Daisy's sinking created a crisis that would challenge everything modern maritime safety experts thought they knew about bulk carrier operations. When the 266,000-ton Very Large Ore Carrier sent her final distress signal on March 31, 2017, the Republic of the Marshall Islands Maritime Administrator faced the daunting task of investigating one of the most catastrophic maritime disasters in recent history. The ship had simply vanished in the South Atlantic, taking 22 of her 24 crew members with her. Evidence methodically presented to investigators revealed the shocking speed of the disaster. The Stella Daisy, carrying 260,000 tons of iron ore from Brazil to China, had transmitted her last radio message at 11:25 p.m. local time, reporting a port list and flooding. Within minutes, the massive vessel had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only scattered debris and 2 survivors clinging to a life raft in the vast expanse of the South Atlantic Ocean. The investigation interviews with maritime experts painted a picture of a vessel that should have been among the safest ships on the ocean. Built originally as a supertanker in 1993, the Stella Daisy had been converted to a bulk carrier in 2009 by Samsung Heavy Industries. The conversion process had involved cutting away the original oil tanks and installing new cargo holds designed to carry dry bulk commodities like iron ore. At the time of her sinking, she was one of the largest bulk carriers in the world. The 2 survivors, Filipino crew members who were rescued by the cargo vessel Benito on April 1, 2017, provided crucial testimony about the ship's final moments. They reported hearing a loud bang followed by rapid flooding and an immediate list to port. The survivors described how quickly the situation deteriorated, with the massive ship listing so severely that launching lifeboats became impossible. They managed to board a life raft just minutes before the vessel disappeared beneath the surface. Expert witnesses testified about the unique dangers posed by converted oil tankers carrying iron ore. The dense cargo created enormous stresses on the ship's structure, particularly in the area where the original oil tanks had been cut away and replaced with cargo holds. Naval architects noted that the conversion process, while technically sound, created potential weak points that might be vulnerable to metal fatigue over time. The competing theories about the Stella Daisy's fate emerged as investigators analysed the available evidence. The first theory suggested that the ship had suffered catastrophic structural failure in the area where the original tanker structure had been modified. The investigators noted that similar conversions had experienced problems, and the stresses of carrying dense iron ore cargo might have exceeded the modified structure's design limits. The second theory focused on the possibility of cargo shift. Iron ore, while normally stable, can become fluid under certain conditions, particularly when exposed to moisture. If the cargo had shifted suddenly to one side of the ship, it could have created an immediate and unrecoverable list. However, the survivors' description of hearing a loud bang suggested structural failure rather than cargo movement. The investigation examined the ship's maintenance history and found evidence of previous structural problems. In 2015, the Stella Daisy had experienced damage to a transverse bulkhead at frame 65, requiring repairs at a dry dock facility. The Korean Register of Shipping had classified this as a minor repair, but investigators questioned whether the damage might have been more significant than initially assessed. Weather analysis for the period of the sinking showed that the South Atlantic had been experiencing normal conditions, with moderate seas and winds. The absence of severe weather ruled out external forces as the primary cause of the disaster, focusing attention on the ship's structural integrity and the stresses created by her massive cargo load. The investigation weighed the most likely explanations based on the physical evidence and survivor testimony. The Marshall Islands investigation concluded that the Stella Daisy had suffered a rapid Lister port following catastrophic structural failure of the ship's hull. The failure was likely caused by a combination of factors, including the conversion process, the age of the vessel, and the extreme stresses created by carrying dense iron ore cargo. The aftermath of the investigation led to significant changes in regulations governing ship conversions and bulk carrier operations. The International Maritime Organization implemented new requirements for structural monitoring and inspection of converted vessels. The case highlighted the unique risks associated with converting oil tankers to bulk carriers and the need for enhanced safety procedures when carrying dense cargoes. The search operations that followed the sinking were extensive and international in scope. Ships from multiple nations scoured the South Atlantic, while aircraft conducted aerial searches over thousands of square miles of ocean. Despite these efforts, only 2 crew members were rescued alive, and the bodies of the other 22 were never recovered. The wreck of the Stella Daisy was eventually located in 2019 by the deep-sea exploration company Ocean Infinity, lying in 3,461 meters of water. The impact on the families of the missing crew members was devastating. The 22 men who perished included 8 South Korean officers and 14 Filipino sailors, leaving behind wives, children and parents who struggled to understand how such a massive, modern vessel could sink so quickly. The survivors' testimony provided some closure, but the families continued to seek answers about why their loved ones had to die. The legacy of the MV Stella Daisy extends far beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about maritime safety and the risks associated with modern bulk carrier operations. The disaster demonstrated that even the largest and most modern vessels remain vulnerable to catastrophic failure when structural integrity is compromised. The investigation's findings continue to influence ship design, conversion procedures, and safety regulations that govern the movement of bulk commodities across the world's oceans. We've journeyed through decades of maritime mystery, from the empty decks of the Mary Celeste to the burnt hull of the Taiqing 21. Each story we've explored represents a puzzle that the ocean refuses to solve, a reminder that even in our age of GPS and satellite communication, ships can still vanish without explanation. The crews are gone, their voices silenced by time and tide. The ghost ships have either sunk to the bottom or been scrapped for metal, but their stories live on because they touch something deep in our understanding of what it means to go to sea. Captain Briggs and his family aboard the Mary Celeste, the young cadets of the Copenhav who never saw home again, the fishermen of the High AIM 6 who simply disappeared. These weren't just statistics or headlines, they were people with families, dreams and reasons for being on the water when disaster struck. Each case we've examined shows us that the ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily. Modern technology has solved some mysteries, but it has also created new ones. Ships equipped with every safety device still vanish. Crews trained in the latest procedures still disappear. The sea, it seems, always finds new ways to humble human confidence. The sea keeps its secrets, and we keep searching for answers.